Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th episode of Intrusible Chamber, Carlism. I am lucky to be joined for his first appearance on this channel, Theo Howard of the Two Cities podcast. Hello.
Good evening, AM. It's a real pleasure to be on your channel. As you know, I've admired much of your work for quite a long period of time, and we met in person a few months ago, and really excited at being able to discuss Spanish traditionalism with you.
So I guess as a point of view of introduction for people listening, what is your channel and what's your main focus? I mean, one of the things I've noticed, among other things, including an interview done on Carlism itself, is a series of audio recordings of Thomas Walsh's Philip II, which I've covered tangentially on this channel. So I'm very interested that you seem to be covering all aspects of Spanish history on your channel.
Yes, I do have a particular interest in the history of Spain, the history of Catholic Spain, and for me that is somewhat personal. I interviewed, as you saw there, the late lamented Don Luis Infante, sadly passed away last year. A friend of mine and a very patient and erudite teacher of traditional Catholic doctrine, from whom I learned a great deal. And also my friend Don Miguel Ayuso, who doesn't give interviews in English, but can speak very good conversational English, and he's illuminated much of the doctrine of Carlism to me over the years. So I'm indebted to both of them, and I will no doubt be citing them at some length this evening. But on the whole, my channel is dedicated to the Augustinian view of history. That is really the Catholic supernatural view that history consists of the war between the city of God, the Catholic Church, and the city of man, the city of the devil, the earthly city. And I seek to, in my broadcasts, apply this lens historically to the history of Christendom, and with particular attention to those lessons and principles that can be extracted from the past, from Catholic history, and applied to the present. So I also conduct political and economic, cultural analysis of contemporary affairs, while also doing my best to offer something of a positive vision for the future. So it's a focus on the temporal sphere in light of supernatural truth. And that's why the history of Spanish traditionalism, Carlism, has been so fascinating to me, because in my estimation, it is I would contend, the purest of the various Catholic counter-revolutionary or traditionalist schools across the world. And I have benefited immensely from the crystalline nature of its doctrine, which continues to be refined, and I think really helps in understanding the Church's social and political doctrine, in that when you read about a principle like subsidiarity, for example, in Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno, that's a very concise, very pithy formula for that principle, the Church's social doctrine. But to see it actually concretized and instantiated in history, of course, one has to study Christendom. And what I find so edifying about Carlism is the way in which the body of thought draws from the past and considers this in light of the Church's the Church's universal doctrine in principles like subsidiarity. I think, seeing as this series is named Intrusible Chamber, I'm sure that you've you've considered Joseph de Maist's famous quotation, know how to be a royalist. In the past, it was an instinct. Today, it is a science. And I find that Carlism is a living science, you might say. It preserves the memories of Christendom, which are eminently precious.
I think you've given a rather sort of beautiful exposition as to the grander notions behind Carlism. I think I'm just going to reverse it back just for the sake of listeners who, I hope humorously, are suggesting in the chat that it may refer to Carl Benjamin or Carl Sagan. And I do apologize to you, Theo, for that.
Right. It's interesting. Carl Benjamin, actually, I've noticed he calls himself a postmodern traditionalist. So it is, I think, highly relevant that, let's say, various right-wingers today are eschewing the label of conservatism, and they're taking up this older banner of traditionalism. And so I think, again, that's where Carlism has so much to offer in actually elucidating what the principles of a true traditionalism are.
So we might have Carl Benjaministas along the way by this by this logic. Well, given the trajectory and the fractious nature of Carlism, that wouldn't really surprise me. But anyway, Carlism, for people who don't know, is a Spanish legitimist traditionalist movement that originated in the Carlist Wars in the 1830s and has various precedents before them, which it's very conscious of. I want to point out that this stream isn't a history of the Carlist Wars. That would be far too difficult an exploration in terms of the nitty-gritty of Spanish political, military, and the relations with other powers, etc. So it's going to be focused more on the ideological precepts, some of which Theo has already brought up. Indeed, what is fascinating, you mentioned de Maistre there. You also mentioned the intrusible chamber. Well, of course, the whole aspect of the intrusible chamber is to be more royalist than the king and to be more Catholic than the Pope. And in this particular sense, that is also an issue which is fraught within the grander context of Carlism, where various thinkers are trying to hold their king accountable for not being true to this vision of Spanish legitimism, which is espoused in 4 phrases: God, fatherland, king, and one I won't translate because it can't really be translated, fueros. Would you like to very briefly explain, Theo, what the implications of those terms are?
Yes, certainly. So, yeah, I think these, for anyone that has a sort of cursory knowledge of Carlism, this quadripartite motto is something that is reasonably well known. The fourth of those terms, fueros, perhaps we might render as charters, as local charters. We can go into that in more detail. That fourth part was added much later. Again, that's part of the refinement of Carlism, as it grew from being a spontaneous reaction of a Catholic people against the assaults of liberalism to more of a defined intellectual school, which had to teach and explain the truths which Spaniards up to that point had lived. So initially it was God, a fatherland, and king. Now, these are timeless and universal themes. And actually, this constellation is something we find throughout Catholic counter-revolutionary movements, legitimist movements in particular. So you find the invocation of the same tripartite motto among the traditional supporters of King Miguel in Portugal. You find them in among the Neapolitan Sanfedisti, and you find them among the Spaniards themselves in their war of independence against Napoleon's troops. These are the strands of a traditional Catholic people's reaction against the liberal revolution. So I can go into detail with those 3 strands if you'd like, unless you want to comment at all at this stage.
Well, no, I think that's that's a good way to start off. Regarding patria, or fatherland, I'm going to hold that off slightly because I have an article which I want to dissect the whole notion of Spanish nationality. But I think that's a good introduction. I mean, there's an aspect which you brought up, which is the international context of legitimism at that time. You mentioned the Miguelists. You mentioned the case of the Bourbon dynasty in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And of course, there was also French legitimism, and you can go much further back to Jacobitism, albeit it isn't so ideologically succinct and coherent, and has birthed such an intellectual legacy as Carlism has. But to look at it as an internationalist movement, I think, would be to rob it essentially of some agency or some distinct quality, or you can almost say authenticity, in Carlist legitimism, which can't really be claimed by other various legitimist movements. So, say, for example, let's take the Jacobites. The Jacobites have elements which are sympathetic towards Catholicism, yet at the same time, it is still fundamentally reconciling to the notion of Anglicanism, and Bonnie Prince Charlie nominally converted throughout part of his life and was a Freemason, among other things. And then you have this friction between the nationality conflicts in Scotland and England, and the whole notion of the revocation of the Act of Union in 1707, which again you can say is somewhat analogous to the whole notion of fueros in terms of the distinct particular characters and charters, legal customs of the various realms beholden to one overall kingdom, in the case of Britain, or in the case of the Spains or Spain. But there's also a contest with French legitimism, because of course the French monarchy existed before 1789. It then made a series of concessions towards the French Revolution in the Constitution of 1791. And rather interesting, Louis XVI, when he was defending himself before the National Convention, he was defending himself on the grounds of adherence to the liberal Constitution of 1791. In the same way that you look at the reign of Louis XVIII during the quote-unquote restoration that restored nothing between 1814, 1815, and 1830. One of the first things he does is institute the July Charter, which is basically a recognition of the French revolutionary settlement that France will mirror more closely in its political scheme that of Britain than that of the historical Capetian monarchy in France, the July Charter. And then it's interesting, you note, there's also a theme in terms of the fidelity to education. So Carlism is very much focused on Thomism. It's focused on scholasticism. It's focused on traditional means of education from the use of the trivium. And it riles against Gallicanism in France, against Cartesianism as well. So there's an element which feeds through into the whole intellectual makeup vis-a-vis France, that France has been innovating since at the very earliest, the 16th century, if not slightly before then, whereas Spain, as the successor of the Catholic majesties Isabella and Ferdinand and of Philip II, has remained truer to that Catholic spirit and has more closely imbibed the Tridentine reform than did France and its pro-Protestant trajectory under Richelieu. All of these interesting things, I think, make Carlism you can say, the purest incarnation of Catholic traditionalism, as you've mentioned, but also the most enduring, because you would think of this and say that this is just a relic of a bygone period, in the sense that we're all talking about postmodern traditionalists here. Indeed, one of the authors that I'm relying on here, Blinkhorn, seems to have a rather skewed conception of some traditionalist concept in terms of the way that he appraises Carlism, by seeing it through these various anachronisms. But what I find fascinating about Carlism is not just the purity of its vision, but also the fact that it's able to consistently adapt beyond what you can say the rather rigid notion of God, fatherland, king, and fueros, with particular emphasis on king. Many Carlists would repeatedly break with various kings, and indeed the ultimate crisis of Carlism towards the end is that finding of a Carlist king, which can not only restore that monarchy in Spain, but can be beholden to our values in some senses. So you see various theorists like Mela, who will go beyond the allegiances towards the Carlist claimant in the form of King Jamie back in 1919, and form his own version of parliamentary Carlism, whilst espousing a maximalist sort of desire that the constitution upon which the monarchy rests after 1876 is in itself illegitimate. So all of these things that would be seemingly in total contradiction, yet also show that Carlism has the ability to constantly remodulate and reform and adapt to its surroundings, especially when we get to the situation in the 1930s towards the end of the conversation. But just talk about Carlism and the youth movement, mass mobilization, the Requites. They're very similar to, say, for example, early incarnations. You would perhaps think of the Boy Scouts or the Wandervogel, the wandering groups in Germany. All of these things are occurring in Spain, and they're imbuing a whole generation around Navarre and parts of Catalonia with this sense of traditionalism. And there is also a regional identity to Spanish Carlism, again, which is perhaps distinct from other forms of legitimism in Europe. The fact that there is a power base in Spain, which is more or less eroded today, but nevertheless for 200 years was based in the north and was the seat of various rebellions, as we'll get into. But I think there's another little thing that you mentioned regarding just fueros, which is the notion of a charter. Well, once you go back to Philip II and you go back to a quote by Charles V, or Charles I in Spain, the Habsburg emperor who once ruled half the world, at least in terms of like the medieval concept of what the world was in the 16th century. To be ruler of all is to be ruler of each. And that, to me, is a summation, effectively, of what Carlism is. Spain is not a unitary state to the Carlists. Spain is the empire of all the Spains. I believe that was a title that Alfonso VII assumed for himself as King of Leon and Castile once he had just taken the city of Toledo, declaring himself as the supreme king over all of the other principalities within the Iberian Peninsula at that time. And thus it is fundamentally medieval and has roots to the very inception of Spain itself. But also I think there are broader implications here, which is that the Carlist system here of fueros, of looking at these regional identities, linking it to Catholic identity and Catholic teaching, and seeing it as part of a greater historically contingent whole, I believe could be perhaps extended to not just Spain, but indeed all of Christendom. But of course, as far as Carlism is concerned, in terms of the legitimacy associated with the particular king, it is focused on the particular historical development and characteristics that would make Spain unique as a Catholic concept of nationality.
Yes, exactly so. There's something you mentioned there about Carlism as ideology, and this is something that Carlists, and I would agree with them, would reject. In that, if we define ideology, following Don Miguel Ayuso, as a distorted vision of reality, superimposed as a theory and a philosophy, it would not accept being seen as an ideology in that sense, because it is or was primarily a people living out a tradition, an inherited order. And the rupture has come from the liberal assaults on Spain. And that maybe can lead us into looking at the first principle of Carlism, which of course is the first principle for any Catholic in their politics, which is divine sovereignty. Contra the innovations and novelties, some of which you've alluded to there, AM, about particularly coming from France, thinking of thinkers like Jean Bodin, of state sovereignty. Even the notion of state, the modern state, is something anathema to a Carlist. The Carlist begins with the recognition of the truth of the Catholic religion, and therefore the first principle is that of Catholic unity, the Catholic unity of the Spains, the Catholic unity of Hispanidad. And this is different to the idea of a confessional state, which itself was a concession from following the Treaty of Augsburg and the survival of the Protestant heresy and the pragmatic agreement in that treaty of cuius regio eius religio. He who is the prince, that will be the religion. The people follow the religion, their prince. Whereas Spain maintained her Catholic unity. And so even the very first liberal constitutions, most importantly, the Constitution of Cadiz in 1812, which was the constitutional point of reference for the liberals in the 19th century following that, which itself is based on the French Revolutionary Constitution of 1791, which you mentioned as well. That begins with a preamble which invokes the Holy Trinity and declares that Spain is Catholic. So it's very strongly Catholic, even fervently so. But it then goes on in the body of the Constitution to affirm the era of popular sovereignty, which to Catholics is a clearly heretical principle. And this is something identified by Cardinal Inguazano at the time as defying the reality of the divine order, the divine and natural order. And so if you are positively declaring that Spain is Catholic, that of course allows for the future possibility of a popular legislative body suddenly legally ruling that Spain is no longer Catholic through simply amending that constitution, as we've seen happen article by article with the Irish constitution. So the Carlists eschew the whole notion of written constitutions, and instead they look to the traditional coronation rights of Spain as expressing the reality of Catholic unity, that just like England, and in fact just like every other European nation, there is no Spain without the Catholic faith. That once Spain ceases to be Catholic, she ceases to be Spain. And this, of course, is the fundamental factor to explain the longevity of Carlism, why it survives, why it continues. Yes, there were fractures, as you've pointed out, but nevertheless, many of those were followed by reconciliations, particularly before some of the Carlist wars and during the Carlist wars, and why it became such a pole of attraction for Spanish Catholics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, who could admire the intransigence of the Carlist cause. One of the descriptions given for my late friend Don Luis Infante was un católico intransigente, an intransigent Catholic, and that really, I think, encapsulates Carlism and the first of its four rallying cries, Dios.
No, thank you for that. I think just in reference to the term ideology, I'm going to be using the term ideology a lot on this stream. Indeed, many of the sources that I'll be using also use the word ideology. It's not meant as a self-descriptor for the whole notion of Carlism, but I think in that whole notion of postmodern traditionalism, I'm always using the terms I employ with an asterisk behind them effectively. I fully concede the whole Carlist notion of the going back to the organic state of historical Spain and Catholic Spain, and that ideology is in many ways a supposition. But again, that's a graded ideology as opposed to the way that I would employ ideology, which is far more sort of universal and politically nondescript, I would say, but definitely concede the whole point and the whole basis of the Carlist critique of ideology. But the first article I have is by Stanley Payne, who is perhaps the foremost historian of the Spanish right in the English-speaking world. He has many books on the Falange. He has many books on. He has a political biography of Franco, among other things. Indeed, one of the issues when doing this stream, and indeed when covering the topic of Carlism, is that obviously everything is taken from the context of the Spanish Civil War, and invariably Carlism is lost amongst a myriad of other quote-unquote right-wing factions, especially Falangism, and obviously with the association with Italian fascism and Nazism in the Anglophone-speaking world, the association to the Falange is therefore more prominent, and Carlism takes a bit of a back seat to that, unfortunately. But nevertheless, I have found some sources for this evening, and Stanley Payne is not talking specifically about Carlism, but he's talking about the whole notion of Spanish nationality. And you brought up the notion that to be Spain is to be Catholic, and to be intransigently so. I'm not sure whether you've watched my stream on Rhodesia, but when you said that, it reminded me of something which is quite significant, I think, in terms of the ideologies that were coming out, again, ideologies broadly encompassing everything, in the early 20th century of the two Spains. Indeed, you see this in the works of Salvador Dali, among other Spanish painters and poets of the time. But this is all baked into the notion of the Reconquista, as you know, which is the Catholic Spain begins in the 6th century. And then you have the Muslim conquest by the Umayyads at the beginning of the 8th century. Now, that isn't Spain, especially in this Catholic conception. It is Al-Andalus, in the same way that one can say, for example, contrast Rhodesia versus Zimbabwe. They are two fundamentally distinct entities superimposed over the same territory.
Correct.
And of course, the whole notion of Reconquista is that Spain returns while Al-Andalus basically recedes and dies and is conquered, hence the whole notion of the Reconquista. And it's baked into this idea fundamentally that to be Spain is to be Catholic. I will quibble about the whole nature of the consciousness of that association, but for the purposes of this talk and the whole notion of the crusading rhetoric that we see in the 1930s, that is very clear. So that whole notion of religion being fundamental to nationality and Spanish identity has to be considered here when I read this. Sorry, here we are. In most of Southern Europe, the epoch of modernization has been accompanied by intense nationalism. This has assumed such specific and sometimes extreme forms that it has given rise to several neologisms, ranging from Italian irredentism to the Greek megali idea, and what Myron Weiner has termed the Macedonian syndrome. Indeed, all of those things have actually been covered extensively on the channel elsewhere. Such features are familiar enough from any reading of Italian or Balkan history. When, however, we turn to the other peninsula of Southern Europe, familiar signs of this nature largely disappear. Spain and Portugal were old imperial powers of a first era of European expansion, which in fact they pioneered, but their modern history has largely seemed to be characterized by frustrated modernization and intense imploding domestic conflict. Untroubled from without after the defeat of Napoleon's invasion, they have remained apart from the great wars of this century, with the sole exception of Portuguese participation in the last 2 years of the First World War. That's definitely a reference to the two world wars and Spanish neutrality there under Alfonso XIII and then under Franco. It is probably fair to say that in no other European country has nationalism been weaker than Spain prior to 1936, and in very few so weak. Some of the basic reasons for this are obvious enough, and again, expanding on what exactly he means by weak nationalism. Spain has been independent since approximately the 11th century, and achieved the first true world empire in human history, long maintaining the status of an established power. And that in itself was part of not just the reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, but the perception of the Spanish imperialists and conquistadors in the early 16th century, among the thought process of someone like a Hernan Cortes, was that this was all part of the continuing reconquista. The traditional Spanish monarchy was confederal in structure and never created fully centralized institutions. Again, there was an attempt to establish those fully centralized institutions to make Spain more Frenchified, but it didn't achieve that. Culture and tradition in Spain were identified with religion in a manner that was more exclusive than in most other Christian lands, creating a climate of national Catholicism that would resist secularization until the 1960s. And again, what Payne here is doing rather explicitly is that he's associating nationalism with a revolutionary epoch that comes out of the French Revolution, i.e., this is secular, liberal, leveling, almost Rousseauian nationalism. And then, of course, we have the counterpart to it in Germany, coming out of the whole revival of Kultur in the 18th century in German political thought. Whereas in Spain, that isn't necessary, essentially, because the whole premise of nationalism, is completely alien to that. And indeed, as we see with the Napoleonic conquest, the attempt essentially to assimilate Spain into the mold of the French Revolution ended disastrously. Similar, due to its geographic location and limited external ambitions, the country has avoided involvement in the major wars of the 20th century. Classical liberalism dominated Spanish political life for more than a century prior to the Civil War of 1936, discouraging military and aggressive ambitions. And again, that's rather contentious but anyway, we'll ignore that for now. Prior to the First World War, the pace of economic and social modernization in Spain was slow. This made it possible to sustain an early 19th century model of elitist liberalism without serious pressure from below until the 1930s. Similarly, cultural life was dominated by the values and attitudes of 19th century liberalism or of traditional Catholicism, discouraging the introduction and diffusion of new doctrines or philosophies except in the working class subculture. Thus, in Spain, expressions of both an early 20th century new right and of generic fascism were at first weaker than elsewhere. And again, this is from the point of view of the Spanish right, mainly emanating out of comparisons with Italy and Germany, that the situation in Spain simply is not analogous to this. And even if we look at the whole notion of Falange, it is still not correct to say it is purely an imitation of, say, for example, Italian-style fascism. This is not to say that there has been a sort of national ideology in Spain. Virtually throughout Spanish history, and again, emphasis on the word ideology that he uses, there has been an idea or a set of attitudes that can be called the Spanish ideology. I'm so sorry, Theo, even though the term is not commonly in use among historians. What I refer to elsewhere as the Spanish ideology refers, first of all, to the opinions originally established perhaps by the Mos-Arab clergy in the south and in the kingdom of Asturias-Leon during the 9th century. According to this kingdom, which would be originally the nucleus of the eventual Spanish monarchy, so we're talking about the beginning of the Reconquista, was charged with a primordial mission to fight for Christendom, expanding its own frontiers and rescuing lands lost to Muslims. At first, the Spanish ideology was a fundamentally minoritarian current that did not triumph completely until the end of the 15th century, reaching a climax in the reigns of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, and Philip II, only to fall into decay in the later part of the 17th century. Yet it never entirely succumbed to the Enlightenment or the rationalist liberalism, reappearing time and again in moments of crisis. During the 19th century, it was reflected in the doctrines of apostolism. Sorry, I really should be able to pronounce that word given my nom de guerre, Carlism and Integrism, and flourished once more in the doctrines of the radical right of the 1930s and the Franco regime, only to perish, presumably definitely, in the secularism of the 1960s and 70s. Yet the Spanish ideology was not the doctrine of modern nationalism, representing simply the Spanish form of national messianism, i.e., Poland as Christ among nations, Moscow as the Third Rome. Rather, it served as the ideological and foundational equivalent to a kind of nationalism in the pre-modern and pre-nationalist era. Its only political content consisted normally of a kind of monarchist traditionalism. And again, looking at this from the view of a non-Catholic academic historian, the point he is essentially trying to announce is that features like Carlism, which we've talked about, Theo, are actually fundamentally conducive to a particular conception of Spanish nationality based on the Catholic Church and based on the fueros, because it is conditional on an early modern conception of the way of which Spain was ultimately united in the late 15th century. And then we see the height of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century. Do you think overall that is a correct assessment? And it's also perhaps a reason as to why Carlism as a authentic traditionalist movement would have a far more pronounced expression in Spain than in other countries in Europe or indeed the world.
So you're asking whether I would affirm Blinkhorn's sort of categories there?
No, there's that Stanley Payne.
Sorry, Stanley Payne.
I wouldn't necessarily say categories, just my overall assessment there, which is that, again, to repeat, that he's basically saying that nationalism is weak, but the nationalism he's talking about is the nationalism of the Enlightenment. Thereby, the nationalism that emanates in Spain is of a fundamentally different kind. It is of a kind which is born out of the Reconquista, of the period of the Catholic majesties of Spain in the early 16th century and of Philip II. And my extrapolation from that is that essentially we can therefore view this as part of the reason as to why the particular Carlist association of nationality would have such an appeal and association with traditionalism that we don't see elsewhere in Europe, owing to the whole basis for Spanish nationality.
Yeah, I wouldn't entirely accept Blinkhorn's lens of nationalism that he's retrospectively casting back there into the past. I think it's worth noting that the national side in the Crusade of 36, the Civil War, were known as the Nationales, the nationals, not the nationalists. So that's an English term which has been, again, sort of cast onto Spain to try and present it in categories which make sense to an international audience. But Carlism, with its fierce adhesion to organic political bodies, to regional identity, to local liberties, local charters, the fueros, local economic institutions, it really doesn't evince those features of the 19th century centralized, romanticist, industrialized nationalism, which you see particularly, for example, in Germany, in France, in those countries, initially of course, as a liberal movement. So, yes, I think the fact that Payne is sort of situating Carlism within the national movement as a whole, he's perhaps sort of, I would say, slightly colouring it a little bit too much with that. Whereas Carlism, as he does mention there, has from the very beginning a keen understanding that the problem lies with modernity. The problem lies with the rejection of God by European man, which has been Spain has been preserved from heresy, from secularization for much longer than the rest of Europe, which has allowed the Catholic order to survive. But there are, as you point out there, with the Bourbon monarchs beginning with Philip V, the new planter laws, some let's say modernizing, centralizing, absolutist policies enacted, although no way near as much as the other European polities, which left them ripe for revolution. And Carlist historians have done a lot of work, particularly in the 19th century, where they identified the liberals with the absolutists. I'm thinking particularly of Aparici Guijaro, where he linked the phenomenon of despotism and liberalism. Anyway, that's perhaps veering somewhat from the question of nationality. But what I think is germane to the Crusade of 36 and Payne's focus is that Carlism was experiencing a strong revival in the early 20th century, and particularly in the years of the Second Republic, an intense revival because of the threat to Spain's Catholic unity. And there was a recognition among pious, normal Spanish Catholics that Spanish Carlism really stood for Spain's intrinsic Catholicity. So the question of national Catholicism, again, that's a Francoist notion which Carlism opposed. Carlism would again criticize the ideas of national Catholicism, the notion that Catholicism should be the basis of the social and political order because it is the natural expression of the inner genius of the Spanish people, or the supernatural expression. Charles Maurras, his principle that France should be Catholic because it guarantees the most harmonious political and social order. Well, it does guarantee the most harmonious and political and social order, but that's not the primary reason that France should be Catholic. Our Lord said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all these other things will be given unto you." So it's loving the faith. Sorry, it's loving your country to the degree that she is faithful to Catholicism, rather than esteeming Catholicism to the degree that it reflects your national spirit. So there's that quite crucial distinction to be made. But anyway, that's I hopefully it's kind of begun to respond to Payne there. I think Payne's very good in many ways, but of course it's important to remember fundamentally he is a liberal. And when studying Carlism, that really is always the fundamental fault line.
Well, yes, indeed. Well, regarding the whole sort of nature of historians, I'm looking at Payne and I'm interrogating these categories, and I think it's important to say that Payne may use that association, but I think for the benefit of people listening, in terms of being careful with the words I use, national Catholicism and the nation as Catholicism, that might seem to be, a pedantic sort of qualifier between those two meanings, but in that essentially everything is delineated between Catholicism as a political program and Catholicism as the natural emanation of whatever polity simply exists in Spain. Now, moving on from that, you've mentioned, I have to, I think, disagree with you from the premise. I'm sure we'll get into more of the details when we go throughout this conversation, because a large part of this presentation, and my understanding essentially, is of the fractious nature of Carlism. Indeed, many elements again and again and again and again result in these crises and these internal feuds. And indeed, I believe one of the reasons why Franco was so lethal to the whole nature of Carlism is that Franco exploited these differences superlatively in order to pit the various Carlist factions off against each other and effectively neuter the movement in order so he could determine the direction of his own national Catholic government, so to speak. But here is an article by one Father John Schumacher on Integrism and the origins of Integrism in Spanish thought. Again, I use it because it's one of these early schisms within the traditional movement, but it's also important, before I get into this, just to explain a very brief trajectory of the whole notion of the Carlist Wars. I've already mentioned that the Carlist Wars begin in the 1830s. You've already mentioned the Constitution of 1812, from which much of liberal thought in Spain seems to be a re-examination, or basically a reincarnation of that various principle. The first war essentially is fought against his daughter, his niece Isabella, King Carlos, over the issue fundamentally of Salic law, before the ideology becomes far more pronounced in terms of the the things motivating the Carlist side versus the liberal side. And that's, to put it very, very, very briefly. Then there's the contention about Charles Louis coming in. I think actually, just for the benefit of people listening, I did go to the effort of creating this just as an explanation of essentially, who are the Carlist claimants. It's not as important
that's helpful.
or fundamental to this conversation as one would think, but I think it's necessary just in terms of being able to understand where we're coming from. And that's the second Carlist War. It doesn't go particularly well. The third Carlist War takes place amidst a whole collapse of the liberal monarchy of Isabella, over which essentially the original war was fought. Not only do you see the revival of Carlism in Navarre and in Catalonia, indeed, going to this map, this is a map of the First War, but nevertheless it shows basically the various fault lines from which Carlism will emanate as a political force. And indeed, if you're going to talk about fueros and nationality, look at this map. It fairly closely aligns to the old Crown of Aragon, the Kingdom of Navarre, and indeed the Kingdom of Old Castile, if you're looking at the boundaries of Spain on the eve of unification with the conquest of Granada in 1492. As a political boundary, that is essentially the basis of the various Spains, and it informs basically a large part of the political geography of Carlism going forward, as you can see. But essentially, I believe that the Third Carlist War was the last great chance the Carlists had to restore a Carlist king to the throne, given the fact that the quote-unquote center-rightists in Spain were going as far as to elect an Italian monarch. There was even a possibility that a member of the House of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen was going to become a Catholic Spanish monarch, and that was used as a pretext to start the Franco-Prussian War, among other things. And indeed, there was, of course, the Spanish Republic before the Alfonsists finally come back in 1874. But I think it's fair to say, Theo, that once the Carlists are finally defeated in that war, Carlism isn't exterminated by any means, as you and I both know. Carlism remains an incredibly potent force in Spanish life, but Carlism thereafter takes on not in terms of its fundamental ideas that it espouses or the historical trajectory of Spain, of which it's basically indebted to, but essentially the whole character of Catholic action and the traditionalist movement effectively changes thereafter. Do you think that's fair to say? If we're going to demarcate this as almost like a Jacobite equivalent in Spain, where we're talking about the Spanish equivalent of the Bonnie Prince Charlie trying to reclaim his throne, and then we have the predominance of intellectual Carlism, local Carlism. You can even say that this is employing the notion of the fight of the king versus the whole prevalence of subsidiarity inherent in all aspects of the Carlist movement. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes, Raphael Gambra, prominent Carlist theorist and historian of the last century, talks about various periods of Carlism, and he calls that period between the Third Carlist War, the end of the Third Carlist War, and the early decades of the 20th century, an intermediate period for Carlism, which is between the traditionalism, which is very close to the land, as I say, was the spontaneous reaction of a Catholic people. And mark of that is how long and bitter the First Carlist War was. Very brutal and protracted, which is I would say a sign, evidence there of how much Catholic Spain, sociologically speaking, reacted to the impositions of various liberal regimes. So it's between that spontaneous, natural traditionalism to our own, the traditionalism of our own time, highly refined doctrinal traditionalism. It's that middle point, particularly the theorizing of Antonia Meyer, who you've mentioned already. But what's another remarkable feature about Carlism is the cycles of revival and decline that it experiences. And I would say that the years of the Second Republic the highly chaotic, anarchic prelude to the Spanish Civil War, may have actually occasioned the possibility, there was a possibility, I would contend, of a separate Carlist uprising of its own. This was something that Manuel Falconde, the Carlist chief delegate, who successfully reconciled the Integralists and the remaining Melists as well, under the red threat that was growing and growing against Catholic Spain. He was making active plans with the full support of Alfonso Carlos, who you see here. Alfonso Carlos there, Alfonso the 13th, the true Alfonso the 13th, or Alfonso the Carlos the First, actually, would be how he'd be titled. How he was titled. He was planning for a separate, an independent Carlist uprising to overthrow the Second Republic, and that wasn't outside the scope of possibility. The Carlist activity in the early 30s was frenetic. There was a huge expansion of Carlist institutions, of circles, of the requetes, the Carlist militia, of the Margaritas, the women's section, of the circulos, the intellectual circles, huge Carlist meetings, and interestingly, heavy use of modern political means of communication, the radio, newspaper. The Carlist newspaper, in fact, El Siglo, what's the second? Anyway, is it El Universe Siglo? Anyway, it's the Future Age. That was one of the highest circulating newspapers in Spain at the time. So it's quite incredible that in the 1930s, more than a century since, or just about a century since, the usurpation of Don Carlos V's throne by the Isabelinos, the liberals, there was still the possibility of a mass uprising. And I think, despite that not occurring, if you subtract the Carlist element from the national cause, it's hard to see a national victory in the Spanish Civil War. Certainly, I think you would have had a much more protracted campaign and less of a swift national victory. So, that's just something to, I think.
Well, no, you're wonderfully sort of preempting a lot of what I have planned later on. I mean, one aspect of how you can refer to this, again, always be wary of grand periodizations in history, but looking at the period of 1833 till 1936, 1939, as a variation of a 100 Years' War in Spain, a 100 Years Civil War, and both begin and end with Carlism, effectively. I think that's fair to say. And I think we would both agree that of the Spanish Right, essentially, that Franco assimilates together elements of the Theta, the program of Robles, and Falangism itself cannibalize a large aspect of Carlist thought. And why wouldn't it, considering Carlism has such a rich intellectual tradition? But just getting back to that, I just want to read from this article again from Schumacher again on the original Integrist split, because it also exposes something interesting, which is the Carlist relationship with the papacy, which isn't as straightforward as many of you may assume. The struggle of the Catholic Church against liberalism in the 19th century nowhere perhaps took such extreme forms as it did in Spain. In a country whose Catholicism was so intimately bound up with its national life and traditions, it was almost inevitable that this struggle should bring on an acute crisis within the Church. The anti-liberal movement, centered around those who called themselves traditionalistas, was to find its ultimate and most intransigent expression in the Integristas, the offshoot of the former group, and that's the distinguishing of Integrists with a more general conception of Integralism. With the Integrists of the Spanish Church, Leo XIII, the Pope, was destined to be even less successful than with its intransigent foes of the Rélement in France, and the struggle within the Church was even more bitter. It is the origin of this ultra-Catholic movement and its unhappy evolution, which this article proposes to study. Inasmuch as the Integrist movement in Spain was an outgrowth of traditionalism, or rather claimed to be the true representative of traditionalist thought, it would be useful to give a sketch of the latter. Basically, traditionalism was a movement rather than a party, a more or less coherent body of thought, whose unity was to be found in the appeal to Spain's glorious Catholic past as the norm for the present. In the course of the 19th century, traditionalist principles came to be incorporated principally, though not exclusively, in the Carlist dynastic movement. The Carlists were the supporters, the pretentious of Don Carlos V, brother of Fernando VII, and his heirs to the Spanish throne in their fight against Isabella II, and later against Alfonso XII and XIII. In large part, however, even the original dynastic quarrel had been ideological in nature, again that word ideology, and it was chiefly the ideological differences which kept the dynastic quarrel alive throughout the century. The traditionalist banner of Dios, Patria et Rey was the expression of a rejection of modern liberalism and adherence to Spain's traditional Catholic monarchy. The concrete formulation of the traditionalist program was perhaps first found in Antonio Apasi, always largely a traditionalist in ideas. Apasi had been driven to Carlist by the excesses of the revolution of 1868. Again, this is the revolution that ultimately leads to the creation of the first Spanish Republic. Note that the republic that's formed in 1931 is actually the second Spanish Republic, a fact that many people forget, and he soon became the representative of Don Carlos in Spain. He defined the traditionalist program thusly: Catholic unity, a king who both rules and governs, a true Cortes in the Spanish tradition, decentralization, and a real life of the municipality, and again that's perhaps a translation of fueros, and of the province, and above all, the Catholic spirit living in the institutions, in the laws, and in the customs. Again, the emanating force, the historic link, and that whole sort of glue that forms the Spanish conception of nationality, which is distinct from a liberal conception of it. Though rejecting the constitutional monarchy of the liberals, Aparci equally rejected the despotism of Fernando VII, and this is an interesting point because it brings up what you and I both regarded earlier with the French Bourbon assumption of power with the new plantation, but rather looked to the medieval Spanish monarchy, limited by the fueros of the people. On the other hand, it was not a blind transfer of past institutions he sought, but an infusion of their principles and spirit into modern institutions. Thus, though deeply conservative, the traditionalist movement retained a certain moderation while under Aparci's leadership. On his death in 1872, however, Candidio Nosadal, a former moderate who, like Aparci, had been driven into the Carlists by the revolution of 1868, succeeded him as head of the party in Spain. Under this direction, traditionalist intransigence soon began to harden considerably. In 1875, Nosadal's son Raymond founded in Madrid the newspaper El Siglo Futuro, with the avowed purpose of defending the pure and integral Catholic and traditionalist doctrine. Though numerous other newspapers of the same tendency soon sprang up elsewhere, El Siglo Futuro distinguished itself for its bitter opposition to liberalism in any form, however mitigated, and this all taking place during the Third Carlist War. Meanwhile, in 1874, the monarchy that had been overthrown in 1868 had been restored chiefly through the efforts of Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, with the young Alfonso XII as king, and this is after a series of contrivances that I've already mentioned. Though Cánovas definitely belonged to the right, he called his party liberal conservative and was willing to encourage such former revolutionaries as Praxedes de Sagasta and Emilio Castella to return to political life. He accepted many of the conquests of liberalism, but he rejected its anti-clericalism, and though his party was not professedly a Catholic one, it defended the rights of the Church. But political realist that he was, Cánovas did not hesitate to establish the principle of tolerance in the new Constitution of 1876, in spite of opposition of the Church, for he insisted, after 8 years of complete religious liberty and even persecution of the Church after the Revolution, it was ignoring facts to attempt to return to intolerance. He proposed, therefore, to permit the private exercise of other religions as a compromise between the extremes of right and left. So again, the right in Spain is basically pursuing the centrist right, you can say, rather than the traditionalist right, is trying to pursue a middle course which is defining the reign of Alfonso XIII. I think it's fair to say, Theo, that Alfonso XIII's reign, it almost defies categorization, simple categorization, in terms of it being an ongoing process of constitutional experimentation with the relationship between the secular state and the religious orders. And of course, it ultimately breaks down with the Primo de Rivera dictatorship in the 1920s. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I've not made a detailed study of the so-called Alfonso XIII's regime. I know that, yes, as you say, it's a volatile period for Spain, and the inner contradictions of progressive liberalism and all the noxious effects of that ideology, the French Revolution, begin to reach even worse implications, especially with the very bad urban situation and the rise of communism. But nevertheless, you have a Catholic revival to a degree, especially in certain regions, certain places, among certain sections of society, which gives Catholic Spain more of a backbone and leads again to that growing polarization in Spanish society and the eventual outbreak of war.
Indeed, I think an interesting way to perhaps frame this is that the moderation of the political center does not reflect a moderation of Spanish political life. It really is a peace accord between factions which are fundamentally irreconcilable. I think that can perhaps explain so much of the lack of enthusiasm towards the reign of Alfonso XIII, kind of like the reign of Louis Philippe in France and the Orleanists, as sort of compromise, a system that no one really wants, but will fundamentally accept it. And of course, as we know, with the whole notion of the various Carlist thinkers that come out of this, they are never reconciled to this, even though they are sometimes willing to make temporary alliances with various quote-unquote center-rightists. But do you think, again, that's perhaps a good way of just briefly analyzing, again, for the benefit of people listening and are thinking that a monarchy has been restored in Spain? Why is that fundamentally insufficient for the Spanish right to look at it basically as a new Orleanist system, which is based essentially on a compromise that no one will accept?
Yes, it's a liberal monarchy, and so the operative word there, the important definition, is that it's liberal, and that is anathema to Catholicism. And so that tension will have to be worked out eventually. And as we're seeing in our own time, liberalism always leads to social decomposition, because any society needs to have some religion, some shared notion of man's nature and his destiny. And liberalism, in pretending to not have an answer to those questions, in saying that Christianity cannot be the basis of the social and political order, is of course passing judgment on the truth of Christianity, just saying we can't be certain enough of the truth of Christianity for it to be the basis of the political order, which is unacceptable to Christians. So it always leads to factionalism, leads to political strife, leads to conspiracies, various parties. You've got the influence of secret societies, the Freemasons as well, the plotting. And I think what's important to point out is that Carlism is trying to restore a world in which the Spanish people can rest in the truth, that there are no more political parties and interminable political squabbles, principally over the division of material wealth, because there is Catholic unity. So it's restoring those laws and institutions which safeguard that Catholic unity. And the liberal monarchy was constructed with the maintenance of those liberal principles, such as popular sovereignty, and that was always going to, in a nation that was so Catholic like Spain, was always going to result in an explosion eventually.
From the beginning, the traditionalists bitterly attacked this provision for religious tolerance and adopted a policy of abstentionism in politics under the new constitution. This split among Catholics, for many good Catholics supported Cánovas, grew daily more bitter. A small group of traditionalists, led by Alejandro Pita-Limón, one of the leaders in the restoration of Thomist philosophy in Spain, soon became convinced of the need of unity among Catholics. Acknowledging in Cánovas' policy the hypothesis that part of the Catholic and traditionalist ideal, which was susceptible of fulfillment in modern Spain, they agreed to work with the Catholics of the Cánovas party, without, however, accepting the conservative program as a whole. They set up, therefore, the Union Católica, whose purpose it was to unite all those who wished to defend the social and political influence of the Church under the direction of the bishops, without prejudice to each one's continuing to belong to a party in which he was working, so far as purely human and temporal questions are concerned. The project received the approval and blessing of Pope Leo XIII in a brief of March 19, 1881, as well as that of many of the bishops. The Archbishop of Toledo, Juan Ignacio, Cardinal Moreno, accepted the presidency of the Union, and a newspaper of the same name was founded to promote the project. For their apostasy, Pidal and his followers were expelled from the Traditionalist Party, and this condemned the Unity project to failure. By the end of 1883, Pidal went to Rome to consult with Leo XIII, and the following year merged his group into the party of Cánovas. Again, you can see, well, obviously with Catholic action and the Kulturkampf and the emergence of Zentrum and quote-unquote Christian democracy, Catholic parties in Wilhelmine and Kaiserreich Germany, and we see the equivalent of essentially you could say mass politics in the French Republic, and the fact that the papacy under Leo XIII is willing to compromise with political parties under republican or liberal monarchical regimes. This is no exception. Another event served to make even clearer the disunion within the Spanish Church. In July of 1881, at the transferal of the remains of Pius IX, there had been violent disturbances in Rome, in which a mob had threatened to throw the body into the Tiber. In the indignation which swept across the Catholic world, in particular Spain, the Nosedales began to organize a national pilgrimage to Rome as a demonstration of Spanish loyalty to the Holy See. The idea won widespread enthusiasm, but it soon became evident that the Nosedales were turning it into a Carlist manifestation, excluding all Catholics who did not conform to their definition of the pure and integral Catholicism. Leo XIII had originally given his blessing to the project, but when news reached Rome of dissensions being raised by the Nosedal plan, a letter of Ludovico Cardinal Jacobini, Papal Secretary of State, requested that a national pilgrimage be abandoned in favor of a diocesan pilgrimage under the immediate control of the bishops. The result was that only 2 small diocesan groups went to Rome, thus giving visible testimony to the prevalent discord. Leo XIII, anxious to secure peace and reconciliation in Spain, as in the rest of Europe, began his long efforts in this direction with the encyclical Cum Multa, which bore the date of December the 8th, 1882. In it, he strongly emphasized the need of union among Catholics, whatever that might be of their political opinions, for the defense of the Church. He emphatically denied that the Church could be identified with any one party, rather that she must remain above all parties. Finally, he urged and exhorted all, especially the clergy, to be guided by obedience to their bishops. The latter exhortation was more than necessary, for when various bishops had begun to support such moves of unity as the Union Católica, they had begun to be attacked bitterly by the intransigents, especially El Ciclo Futuro, as being traitors and bad Catholics. The intransigent movement found very wide support among the lower clergy, and their fanaticism led to widespread insubordination. Benito Vilhelmintana de Villa, Archbishop of Tarragona, was forced to close his seminary, dismissing many of the professors and large numbers of the seminarians. Other bishops had similar experiences. Again, we see the crisis in the Catholic Church and the lack of unity and the desperate attempts to superimpose notions of unity in Spain in the 1880s. It does sort of ring quite true to the the condition of the Leo XIV that we see today, or at least that's just my my reading of it. With a few exceptions, the bishops loyally accepted the exhortations of the encyclical, and they were followed by a majority of Catholics. Not so the intransigence of Nosedal's faction, however. The justification they gave for their attitude was set forth in an article by Juan Orti de Lara, professor of metaphysics in the University of Madrid, in his review La Ciencia Cristiana. He explained that contrary to what might first appear at first sight, the Pope did not want the union of all Catholics of every party, but only those worthy of the name who aren't contaminated by the leprosy of liberalism. For since all parties outside the Carlists were infected to a greater degree or less with liberal principles, by this fact they had placed themselves outside of Catholic truth, for it was impossible to be a liberal and to be a Catholic at the same time. Therefore, any who belonged to such parties were immediately excluded from the union of the Catholics. The continuing conciliatory policy of Leo XIII, as loyally carried out in Madrid by the papal nuncio, Archbishop Mariano Rapolo di Tindaro, could only go further to arouse the ire of the intransigent faction. When the Canovas government had disavowed an alleged offence to the Italian government in such a way as to aggrieve the Holy See by its acknowledgement of the extension of the temporal power, Juan Antonio Pi de Montesera, Bishop of San Juan, Puerto Rico, announced an interpellation of the Senate, of which he was a member. Fearful of the political consequences, Canovas obtained through Rapolo that the papal secretary of state ordered the bishop to desist. At the same time, Pedro Casuto, Bishop of Plasencia, had published a letter vigorously attacking the government and the institutions of the monarchy. Again, Cardinal Jacobini, apparently at the instigation of Rapolo, admonished the bishop in the name of the Pope and sent a brief to the nuncio regretting the Pope's conduct. At this point, Nosedal published an article sharply attacking the nuncio, declaring that the authority of the bishops was superior to that of the nuncio in church state affairs, and among other things, asserting that when the nuncio spoke of good relations between the Holy See and the Spanish government, he was speaking only as a diplomat. Therefore, his declaration did not have any necessary relation to the truth. The article was soon condemned by name in a letter of Jacobini as being Febronian, and Nosedal was forced to retract. By Febronian, we're talking about Gallicanism. We're talking about the supremacy of the national church over the universal church in Rome. And again, this isn't just an issue which is particular to France. You see these issues prevalent throughout all of the quote-unquote national churches that arise within Christendom. Of course, we fundamentally know that the issue in England became so far pronounced that Henry VIII decided to declare that he was the supreme governor of the church and that he could supersede the Pope's authority within the bounds of his kingdom. But nevertheless, I think what has really been observed here is that whilst the Carlists, and these are the quote-unquote the intransigents who were later split off effectively for their own criticisms of the Carlist monarchy, are having to deal with the papacy that they believe is at odds, and therefore they're having to reconcile themselves with what essentially does Dios represent within the whole notion of Catholic Spanish identity, if it also represents a conflict with the diocese, a conflict with other Catholics, and a conflict with the Pope, even though, as being reiterated in the article, the notion here essentially is that liberalism and Catholicism are irreconcilable, and yet so many Catholics have gone over to support the regime to which the Carlists will not give their assent, essentially. Just before I finish the article, what do you have to say to that?
Well, this is a really pivotal moment, and we're dealing with many issues of prudence here. And of course, humans being fallible, there perhaps were not the optimum decisions made. But what we're seeing here is the church fighting a fierce rearguard battle against liberalism following the revolution with a capital R. Liberalism in all countries, the mother of all ideologies. As Miguel Casada, my friend, points out, in the doctrinal field, we see with the popes Gregory XVI, Pius IX, Leo XIII, no room for equivocation or doubt about their condemnation of liberalism. But in practice, there was a diplomatic, pastoral, policy, you might say, of conciliation and rapprochement with liberal republican regimes, liberal monarchical regimes as well, which of course the most paradigmatic example is that of the ralliement, and I produced a number of videos on that. And basically here, the convenience of maintaining a peaceful relationship with the new powers became a source of pressure on Rome, particularly at the Secretariat of State, where there was perhaps infiltration of enemies of the church. Again, I go into more detail if anybody's interested in finding out more about that. And so there is a legitimate concern for souls and for the provision of the sacraments in these liberal regimes. But practically, it meant that the popes recognized the new regimes, although they condemned them fiercely in theory. And this goes back earlier in the 19th century when the papacy, for example, recognized the independence of the liberal Masonic republics that had revolted against Spain, against the Spanish monarchy in Latin America, with strong British support for those liberal forces. So
and indeed strong English support for the cause of Isabella and the liberals in Spain.
Yeah, it's very, very much worth pointing out, because it's not something that I think we Englishmen hear too much about. I think there's greater realism today in understanding the evils of the American empire, but we also must look honestly at the evils of the British Empire and the way in which it acted as an aggressive, secularizing, modernizing, Judaizing agent against traditional Catholic societies across the world. But that's maybe a topic for another day. But given this context, given these circumstances, there was a tension within the ecclesiastical hierarchy about how to deal with these new liberal powers, and there was this argument about practical accord with liberal regimes while still maintaining doctrinal opposition, and the practical ralliement did eventually become the papal policy. Although interestingly, that applied to countries like Spain, which recognized the usurping liberal Isabelline monarchy in the 19th century, and then the Alphonsine monarchy as well. And then, of course, most famously in France with the recognition of the French Third Republic, but didn't extend to recognizing the usurping Savoyard Italian monarchy, which had actually taken the papacy's own temporal principalities all the way until the Concordat in the 1920s. So there was somewhat of a different standards, a double standard applied by the papacy in this time. So while I admire, I think many traditionalists, of course, deeply admire and cherish the social and political teaching of the ultramontane period of the post-revolutionary pre-conciliar popes, we also recognize that with the important exception of St. Pius X, and exceptions otherwise with a number of other policies, but generally there was compromise with the growing secular powers around the world, which of course led ultimately into the Second Vatican Council and effectively the diplomatic and practical ralliement sliding into a theological ralliement, and basically a surrender to the modern world.
And if people want to know more about the peculiar case of the Savoyard monarchy and its relationship with the church, I have actually done a stream on that, so check that out. Meanwhile, Don Carlos, the pretender king, so this would be on this map, Carlos VII, you can see with his magnificent berry in the image on the top right, had observed with growing alarm the attacks on Raymond Nosedal, the nuncio, and the bishops, as well as the insubordination of Nosedal towards himself in reference to the frequent admonitions he had given him not to attack other Carlist publications for not being pure and integral in their doctrine. When Candido Nosedal died in 1885, Don Carlos did not appoint Raymond to succeed his father as party leader within Spain, as had been expected. The crisis was not long in coming, so this is 10 years after the last Carlist War. In 1887, the Marquis de Valdespina, one of the directories set up to run the party, issued an order to all Carlist papers to obey the chiefs of their respective regions, and he prohibited all polemics between Carlist publications. Since this order was scarcely obeyed, Don Carlos attempted to put a definite end to the situation in an article published under the inspiration by Don Luis Maria de Laude, editor of the Carlist paper Barcelona El Correo Catalán, entitled El Penacimiento de Dolce de Madrid. Again, I don't speak Spanish, so I do apologize to everyone. In it, he declared that relations between church and state ought to be subject of polemics among Carlists, since these not to be subject to polemics among Carlists, since they would be arranged when the time came by mutual agreement between the civil and spiritual power, and that the organization of civil government would be freely decided upon by the Cortes of the nation with the king. But for the moment, what was necessary was absolute submission to the authority of Don Carlos, who alone had the right to judge authoritatively what doctrines were liberal. This dogmatic assertion of authority immediately raised a storm of violent opposition, to which Don Carlos replied by suspending the most intransigent of the papers, El Tradicionalista. When Nosedal protested, he replied on June 14, 1888, sternly demanding his obedience and invoking the necessity of a judge who was outside and above all discussion, the king. This was too much for Nosedal, who joined his own adhesion to that of the other 20-odd papers, which had declared their solidarity with the traditionalists. On July the 9th, the expulsion of the rebellious group from the Traditionalist Party was proclaimed. The rebels replied on July the 31st from Burgos with the Manifestation de la Prensa Tradicionalista, attacking Don Carlos bitterly for his absolutism and for his compromises with liberalism, in contravention of all the most sacred principles of traditionalism. With this document, the formal founding of the Integrist Party may be said to have taken place, and for reference for the Integrists, under Nosedal, the Integrists remained hostile to Carlism throughout the remainder of Charles VII's pretense, even allying with liberals to defeat Carlist candidates in elections. So it basically becomes in some way self-defeating with regards to that. But again, it's a subtle admission again that one can use the four-part mantra of fatherland, king, God, and fueros, but ultimately these points have come into contradiction at the height of a crisis within Catholicism itself and its ability to reconcile with the regime post 1876. And from the point of view of someone like a Nosedal, he is being, you can almost say, excommunicated from the movement, essentially for being too pure in his ideological commitment to Carlism, to the point of offending the diocesan representatives of the papacy. And in that case, the king takes the step essentially to exclude them from the movement. And again, we see this with the Falcondistas as well, that the relationship with the king and the movement is essentially pivotal, for all, the notion that we can speak of this as a movement, an intellectual movement. Restorationism and legitimism is a core component of Carlism. And fundamentally, if there is a uncontested candidate, in this case in the form of Don Carlos at the turn of the 20th century, then essentially he is the political leader of a movement, and the de facto political leader of a movement, as well as being the de jure king of Spain at the same time. And that essentially entails a level of political control and centralizing control, which again is another issue regarding to the whole mantras of keeping a political movement together that can maintain its loyalty to the king and to the Pope, but also maintain adhesion to these principles. And I think just getting your comments on that, because all of these ideas, which I'm just summarizing, are also in evidence when one talks about Meyer. And one talks about the great historian, political theorist, polemicist, journalist. All of these issues reoccur, but generally, what's your thought on that?
Well, Carlism, as I pointed out at the beginning, is the oldest political movement in the world. So inevitably, you're going to find moments of contention and even division. I think that given that we have such a large panorama to examine when it comes to Carlist history, one can actually step back and see how these various disputes, schisms, and then reunions, as happened with the Integrists, actually led to a refinement of the doctrine. So, I'm not familiar with the particulars of the dispute which you've read out there. I'd be interested to know, for example, what they mean by, earlier on you mentioned opposition to private religious practice. Like, what do they mean there? Because Catholic polities never opposed private religious practice in the sense of, private Protestant prayer in your home. Is he actually referring to there the establishment of Protestant conventicles or synagogues, for example, which he's categorizing as private, but actually in a Catholic understanding would be public? So there's kind of wrinkles like that, which I'd be interested in looking into. But yes, Nosodal's party, his schism is interesting because it shows what does Spanish traditionalism look like when it's sundered from the monarchical political form, when it's sundered from the legitimist family line. And I think what you see sort of over the subsequent history, which I'm more familiar with, is clericalist tendencies because of that loss of balance between the laity. Of course, politics is the apostolate of the laity. So that loss of balance between the lay role and the clerical role to supervise lay political action, and a kind of intellectualism because of the divorce from the embodied reality of the royal family and the embodied nature of legitimism in the king. So it's interesting that I suppose with Integrism, how it doesn't last and eventually it does return to the fold, and how all four elements of the Carlist motto are integral, are all essential parts of Spanish traditionalism and can't be removed and survive as a movement. And I imagine that following these disputes, doctrinal and practical principles were reached about the authority of the king, for example, to actually interpret church doctrine with regard to liberalism, with regard to interaction with liberal regimes, and all these very contentious issues that are at stake here. So yeah, it is interesting. We'll maybe come on to later, but the twofold principles of legitimacy are both legitimacy of blood, the adhesion, as you say, to the semi-salic law, and the rejection of the liberal dynasty with the sort of legislative coup d'état in the last years of Ferdinand VII and the pragmatic sanction, but also legitimacy of conduct, which was actually expressed just before Carlos VII became the Carlist claimant, Carlist king, and that was in relation to, I've got a family tree here actually. That was in relation to his father, who was of liberal opinion, and so his rights to the Spanish throne were voided, and this was declared by the Princess of Beira, who was a great Carlist female heroine, in her charter of the Princess of Beira to the Spanish people in the decade of the 60s in the 19th century, which was a decisive moment when Don Juan, who was liberal prince of the legitimate dynasty, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Carlos VII. So all of these historical circumstances, I contend, are refining the doctrine as well as exposing some of these tensions at the time.
Well, yes, it is an evolution, and the whole nature again of politics is reformulating these ideas with the benefit of political experience. And again, if Carlism is to be looked as a historic phenomenon, not simply something as existing historically, but as considering its identity to be contingent on historical developments, then it's only natural, essentially, that that would be the relationship to it. And again, thank you for bringing up the example of Juan III, who I have in the center and the top here, because elements of that are going to repeat with Jamie and the experience with Mela. I've already mentioned the fact that Charles VII had sponsored many Carlist newspapers, which again is a great innovation of Carlism. The fact that they are applying to mass media at the time, essentially at the point of its inception. In particular, Mela joins the El Correo Español, which is still around, interesting enough, in Bilbao as a Basque paper, albeit it's definitely not espousing a traditionalist Carlism now, but it was founded as a Carlist newspaper. And Mela contributed to this, and he formed a friendship with one of the leaders of this time of Carlism, the Marquis de Coralbo. Indeed, Coralbo, again, you can say this is anachronistic and this is a historiographical appellation which is being bestowed onto it. But a word that's been associated with Coralbo is New Carlism. And New Carlism because it's participating in parliamentary elections in the constitutional monarchy, in the various elections to the Cortes, which have the whole power of the Cortes fluctuates throughout the case of the Alfonsoist monarchy, but nevertheless, it's something that even you can even say a maximalist like Mela, a true believer, was willing to partake of and form alliances with, even though he would rail against the possibilicists and other people he believed were willing to compromise too far for the sake of allowing Carlism to have a practical political formula. Indeed, I think one of the features of this new Carlism is that while Mela was part of a conspiracy and it actually resulted in some revolts during the Spanish-American War, the thought was essentially that after the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and as a result of the war, which was basically the end of the Spanish Empire as was, and it ultimately reconsolidates around a few concessions in Morocco and West Africa. But fundamentally, the Spanish Empire, since Columbus, have ended with the Spanish-American War, and it caused a huge amount of tumult and an identity crisis within Spain itself. And many Carlists believe that this was the time to precipitate a fourth Carlist war. But nevertheless, the new Carlist mode, you can say, predominates over the more traditional role of that Jacobite spirit of the call to direct action in a rising of the monarchy against this false monarchy in the form of Alfonso XII. But it's sufficient to someone like Mela to cause him to leave Spain. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, he is at times willing to work with conservative factions. So when he comes back, he becomes the charismatic personality of the parliamentary faction of Carlism under Bartholomew Feliu. And it was during this time that the Requites were also formed, as I mentioned, in terms of the various influences which go into them as a youth movement, as a movement for mass Catholic action, and later as a paramilitary force, and essential in terms of being able to understanding their relevant significance and their contributions to the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 1939. Charles dies and is replaced by Jamie. For the Melists, as it was with the Integrists, the question is now how to reconcile a traditionalist movement with a legitimist one, as you and I have been discussing, when the king essentially became somewhat of a perceived ideological deviant. So, for example, the First World War was a galvanizing moment for the Melists. The Melists were anti-Entente because they were anti the Masonic French Republic. They hated everything about the French Republic and they believed the British were aiding and abetting that. But for King Jamie, he was a soldier who had spent most of his life in the service of the Russian army before retiring to Austria. So his sympathies lay more with the Entente, which in part also facilitated his house arrest within Austria. So this also meant the king was at odds with the most vocal parliamentary faction within Spain at the time, but the king was no longer a practical consideration for day-to-day politics because he was effectively out of the political arena. And this sets essentially the trajectory for Melo's traditional movement to become a political party over simply that of a restorationist advocacy group. And it's as a result of this, with the end of World War I, that these forces come together and result in that split between the Melists and the restorationists under Jamie. But nevertheless, you can say it's a testament to the strength of monarchist feelings within Carlism itself, that Jamie comes back and is able to win over the vast majority of Carlist supporters, and indeed, as you mentioned, some of the Integrists back into Carlism as a political force to prevent it basically collapsing with this ultimate political schism. And Melo doesn't become this anathematized figure to the Spanish Carlists, rather he recedes as a political figure and remains as the great political theorist. Indeed, many Carlist theorists regard him as the master in terms of traditionalist thought within this whole scheme of 20th century Spanish history. So again, it's a significant moment of friction within that movement, but it basically falls under the Primo de Rivera regime. And then we have to talk about Catholic mobilization and action in the 1930s. But just before we finally get to the Spanish Civil War, just what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, there's a period I'm not too knowledgeable about, I have to say. I've done more reading on the genesis of Carlism and the reign of Ferdinand VII in leading up to this very pivotal time in Spanish history. So no, I other than to offer what Alvaro Dawes said, that legitimacy is like the seal of a bottle that prevents political essences from evaporating and guards the authenticity of the content. We only know if we are drinking vintage wine if the bottle is properly sealed. So that explains, I think, why, again, this attempt to sequester Spanish traditionalism away from the person of the king has never really worked, because, of course, as you mentioned earlier, what Spain is, or what the Spains are actually a very diverse group of peoples who are united by two things: by the same faith and the same king, and not really much else in the medieval and early modern periods. So I think once history bears testimony there that political movements without Catholic political movements without a monarch, a father, they have been rather short-lived. But there has been, as you also mentioned there, fierce disputes sometimes among Carlists about the degree to which they should be involved in electoral politics. And that's always been a pragmatic, prudential question about temporary alliances accidentally speaking rather than essentially speaking with other Catholic groups, but with always maintaining that vision, that integral vision of returning Spain to the actual legal, social, political order that obtained in Spain. It's the revolutionaries who have changed that status quo, and it's about reversing that. But as time goes on, as Carlos VII says, adapting that to modern circumstances. So the Carlists are not, for example, they are not. What's the name now? The name escapes me. Those that destroy industry.
Luddites.
Luddites, thank you. Yes, they're not Luddites. Even though industrialization, which comes quite late in Spain, is causing significant turmoil in the social fabric, they're not looking to destroy the new industries, but instead apply Catholic principles to the management of and coordination of those industries, and taking them away from the money power. That's a really crucial point. So anyway, no, that's all I really have to say on Don Jaime. And
so I want to contextualize the Spanish Civil War within this sort of reaction to the anti-clerical and later the atrocities committed against Catholicism in Spain. I have it's a very succinct summary of this period by Michael Burleigh in Sacred Causes. It's not pertinent to Carlism in and of itself, but it's just a very quick, concise summary of the whole nature of the reaction of the Republic against Catholic Spain. Spain was ruled between 1923 and 1930 by an improbable military dictator, Miguel Primo de Rivera, who once sagely remarked, "Had I known in my youth that I would one day have to govern this country, I would have spent more time studying and less fornicating." Primo was followed into exile by King Alfonso XIII, except the latter chose Rome over Paris as a temporary domicile. And again, this is taking place after that schism, which I alluded to with Melo. The Spanish Republic was proclaimed based on a provisional coalition cabinet of Republicans, Reformists, Socialists, and the conservative Catholics Mora and Zamora, whose token presence was supposed to reassure the upper classes. This government embarked on a program of agrarian and military reforms during a global depression which alienated intransigent elements of the economic right without satisfying the raised hopes of its lowlier supporters, who in the disillusionment turned to anarchist or revolutionary socialist alternatives like we saw with Asturias in 1934. Both the Vatican and the papal nuncio, Federico Dedicini, greeted the advent of the Republic with near equanimity, since Dedicini had brokered contacts with the Republicans before they came to power. Like I said, it's just the continuation of this spirit of the Relimo. Indeed, when the Spanish primate Cardinal Seguro delivered a provocatively pro-monarchist sermon and was declared persona non grata by the government, the Vatican acquiesced in his expulsion and found him an alternative career as a curial cardinal in Rome. Anarchist and left-wing anti-clericalism, enabled by the highly fissiparous right to regroup, while also reconnecting the millions of ordinary Catholics whose sensibilities had been offended by the mobs which in May 1931 sacked and burnt about 100 church properties in Madrid and other cities, allegedly in response to earlier monarchist provocations. Opprobrium spread to a government, including its Catholic Republican members, which not only refused to stop the incendiaries on the ground, but that all the convents in Madrid are not worth the life of one Republican, and needlessly ordered the removal of all religious symbols from schoolrooms. Although the exiled monarchists tried to recruit Pope Pius XI to their cause, the Pope remained steadfastly neutral. The marriage of Alfonso's daughter to an Italian prince was celebrated in the Jesuit church in Rome by Cardinal Segura. The Spanish government protested. When the assembled throng of monarchists sought a papal audience, the Pope kept them hanging around in the January chill for the briefest of blessings from an upstairs window. The newly elected left Republican and Socialist coalition in June of 1931 further provoked the religious with controversial articles in the new constitution, Spain's first experiment in real democracy, quote unquote. This went much further than the legal separation of church and state, so we can regard this as something equivalent to laïcité that we saw with Émile Combes in France in the early 20th century. It extruded the church from education, restricted its property rights and investments, and dissolved the Jesuits, who played a role in liberal and leftist mythology equivalent to that of the Freemasons, the Jews, the Marxists, in the demonology of their opponents. This last measure was a bitter pill to swallow in the homeland of St. Ignatius Loyola. Civil marriage and divorce were legalized, while the agreement of the authorities were henceforth necessary for any public celebration of religion, another indigestible measure in a society where religious processions were a highly developed art form, and that's to put it mildly. A supplementary law in 1933 nationalized all church property, including secularizing the cemeteries by putting them under local authority control, dismantling the walls that separated the dead religious from their non-believing fellows. Having nationalized church property, thereby ignoring the wishes of those who had donated it, the government then taxed the clergy who used it. Measures against the church charities simply hurt poor people. The government also closed all religious schools, and since they educated 20% of the Spanish children and were not replaced by secular alternatives, this sat oddly with the Republicans' supposed intent of the expansion of education. Although these measures were implemented with varying local intensities, there could be no doubt that preventing the ringing of church bells, removing religious symbols from classrooms, bureaucratizing the procedures for those wanting religious funerals, grievously irked many Catholics. Officious insistence that dying people fill out forms to get the send-off they wanted failed to charm their friends and relatives. These measures were condemned by Pius XI in the forceful 3rd of June 1933 encyclical delicatissima nobis, which, while carefully professing indifference to forms of government, stress the hypocrisy of these measures in terms of those declared principles of civil liberty on which the new Spanish regime declares that it itself is based. These laws were the product of a hatred against his Lord, Jesus Christ, nourished by groups subversive to any religious and social order, as we have seen in Mexico and in Russia. Republican Spain had become a terrible triangolo, whose object was the eradication of religion. Anti-clericals in the Cortes responded in kind with snide remarks about the mercantile society of Jesus, while the socialist leader Athena crowed that these 1931-3 measures, Spain had ceased to be Catholic. And regarding the actual effects of the atrocities during the war, in the Republican-held areas, nearly 7,000 clerics were murdered, the majority between June, July, and December of 1936 in anti-clerical atrocities that eclipsed even those of the Jacobins in France. Over 4,000 of those victims were diocesan priests, as well as 13 bishops, but they also included 2,365 male regulars and 283 nuns. Contrary to mythology, these nuns were not sexually assaulted or raped, but they were shot, suggests a remarkable depth of feeling. There was no evidence that the clergy had aided the military uprisings, nor that the houses of God were misused as rebel arms dumps. Sorry, I lost you there.
That's all right. Yeah, I heard all of that.
Good. Where was I? Well, a few priests were made public, broadcast supporting the rising. There was also scant support for the idea that sharp-shooting priests took pot shots from their belfries. Churches were routinely the tallest structures in towns and villages, so all combatants automatically made a beeline for them to get the most advantageous firing positions. Clergy who found themselves caught up in the fighting simply by dint of being trapped in a church were routinely executed in the war. That developed into one of the few prisoners. Anti-clerical violence struck at the buildings and images, as well as afflicting both the quick and the dead. One of the most heavily publicized photographs was a Republican militiaman lined up to shoot the statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus atop the Cielo de Los Angeles outside Madrid. The statue was subsequently blown up because, having been dedicated to Alfonso XIII, it vividly symbolized the hated union of throne and altar. According to Franz Bockenau in Sitges and other coastal places, pious people were forced to bring objects of worship to beachside bonfires where children amused themselves by defacing the statues before burning them. The sight disgusted them. The pro-Republican Daily Telegraph correspondent Cedric Salter described the terrible scenes in Barcelona. On my way down into town, I passed a burning church. The flames had only caught at one end of the building, and I pushed my way into the entrance. Flames were licking up round the altar, on which stood two beautifully wrought silver candlesticks gleaming through the clouds of black smoke. From the high carved stone pulpit, an elderly priest swung very slowly to and fro by his sickeningly elongated neck. He had offered resistance, a guardia told me, when they had seized the sacred wafer, and hurled it into the flames and had died cursing them. Around the walls, and again this is the desecration of the host, around the walls the pale painted faces of the saints slowly distorted into nightmare grimaces as the heat melted the wax of which they were made. Lower down, just above the British consulate, a crowd had formed outside the entrance to a convent. I went in with them and found a long wall lined with coffins from which the lids had been stripped. The poor, centuries-old bodies of the nuns were exposed, and with the flesh still clung to their bones, were slowly blackening in the hot sun. Fresh coffins were being excavated from the convent burial ground, and a paesta was being charged for the hire of a long stick with which to strike or insult with unamenable obscenities those sightless, shrunken relics. A charnel house stench and my own sick horror drove me back into the street. Now that's just a context by a very secular-minded historian, effectively, of the horrors that the religious right in Spain were having to deal with in the 1930s, just to give you a summary. But before I get on finally to Carlist action in the 1930s, just any thoughts on that?
Well, that's a small portion of the horrendous persecution of the church, which was orchestrated and initiated during the Second Republic and escalated during the years of that regime. Altogether, I believe it was the heaviest persecution of the church, the highest number of deaths of priests and religious since the persecution of Diocletian, and in a much smaller area as well. So it really demonstrates the intense bitterness and hatred of the enemies of the church, and how justified the Crusade of 36 was, as Catholic Spain basically refused to be exterminated, which was what was being attempted.
So this is the anticipated article from Martin Blinkhorn. This is an article version of his book, again for the sake of conciseness for the stream, concision for the stream, Carlism and the Spanish Crisis of the 1930s. The birth and early weeks of the Second Republic, and in particular its anti-clerical posture, engendered an atmosphere of alarm and uncertainty among Spanish Catholics, which had the effect of abruptly reversing Carlism's decline. Almost overnight, the movement's sense of purpose reawoke, its activity intensified, and its numbers began to increase as lapsed former Carlists cast aside their apathy and returned to the ranks, and then as proselytization, especially among the disillusioned Alfonsists, brought its rewards. This early revival was only to be expected, was concentrated overwhelmingly in the areas of residual Carlist strength, such as Navarre and the Basque provinces, the pockets of Catalonia, Castellon, and Valencia, as you can see on this map, where they had, again, this is a map of the First Carlist War, but it's just a testament to even 100 years later how enduring that regional character of Carlism has been, where there had survived an organization capable of undertaking the work of recruiting and absorbing new and returning Carlists. In these regions, numerous new local circles were established. The expansion in the youth, student, and militia sections of the movement was particularly marked. Nevertheless, the existing provincial and regional leadership continued in office. The essential character of the movement remained unchanged. Northern and Eastern Carlism during the Republic drew its vitality not from its organizational strength, but from its deep roots in local and family tradition, its mass membership coming largely from farming families, and its upper echelons manned by the same elite of lawyers, doctors, local businessmen, and rural proprietors, which had run it since 1876 at the end of the Carlist Wars. The national organization was headed by an aging, infirm, and ineffectual aristocrat, the Marquis de Villores, and existed only in name. In reality, the Carlist organization in 31 was a loose federation of regional, provincial, and local committees, in which overall direction and coordination were almost totally absent. And this is during the last year of the claim of King Jamie or King Jaime. The Carlist Renaissance received a vital boost during the winter of 31 to 32, with the return to the fold of two dissident factions, as you mentioned, the Integrists, an intransigent minority who had rebelled against the modernism of the pretender Carlos VII in 1888, and the Mellists, who, in 1919, had followed Vasquez de Mella into schism against Carlos VII's son, Don Jaime. The reunification of Spanish traditionalists was encouraged by the political-religious atmosphere of the Republic, but what really facilitated it was the death of Don Jaime in October 1931, and the assumption of the Carlist claim by the octogenarian uncle, Don Alfonso Carlos, you can see on the bottom left here. Although by 1931, the actual number of schismatics was not very great, the fusion of the three factions of traditionalism, sealed amid unrestrained jubilation, was crucial to Carlist morale and beneficial in other respects. From the Mellist ranks, for example, came Victor Pradera, protege of Mella himself and the sole traditionalist intellectual of national standing, whilst the Integrists brought with them El Siglo Futuro, a Madrid daily newspaper, which became an important addition to Carlism propaganda armory. Moreover, there were whole regions of Spain, and in particular Andalusia, where traditionalism had been kept alive only through the efforts of a tiny nuclei of middle-class Integrists, whose adherents now gave Carlism a base in southern Spain, which otherwise might not have established. So this is basically a reinforcement of the claim you made earlier, Theo, regarding the fact that Carlism experienced various very dramatic fractures throughout its very long history, but the cause of resistance against the Spanish Republic, as you can tell by the segment I read from Burleigh, just to illustrate how vivid it was, is enough effectively to reinfuse mainstream Carlism now under the leadership of King Alfonso Carlos, with all of this intellectual and force of numbers, essentially, that it had hitherto lacked in the 1920s following the Mellist split against Don Juemi. So yes, just to reinforce your point, really.
Yeah, exactly. It's, we see this phenomenon, of course, universally, that as evil advances, the lukewarm, the indifferent, the ignorant, they are roused to the and provoked towards truth, towards goodness, and that's what we see here. And suddenly, the perhaps more insignificant and personal altercations and differences melt away in the face of real danger to Spain's very existence, the Catholic Church's existence in Spain. And so, very, very providential moment, I think, quite instructive about, how things might evolve in the future with the progress of the revolution and various counter-revolutionary forces that oppose that, how a traditionalist movement might coalesce as the revolution advances.
But it's also interesting to consider that the effect was almost immediate. Within a year of the creation of the Republic, and as Burleigh conceded, there were attempts to at least have token figures on the right, quote unquote, within the Spanish Republic, like Zamora, but nevertheless, no one took this seriously. And even under the leadership of an octogenarian in the form of Alfonso Carlos, again, his remarkable energy, considering his advanced years, in order to be able to regalvanize that moment, even though he himself would represent the last of the mainline Carlist claimants. From the end of 1931, Carlism, now officially named the Traditionalist Communion, not only maintained its expansion in its home areas, but also began to make progress in regions of little or no Carlist tradition. Again, the name Traditionalist Communion has been used a long time, but this is more of an official declaration, as opposed to what had basically been assumed as a label or a signifier before then. Outstanding in this respect was the development of Andalusian Carlism, whose influence on the communion's internal politics, if not perhaps upon national or regional affairs, was become considerable. The curious phenomenon of Carlism's sudden flowering in soil so apparently infertile as that of Andalusia was the result of the fortunate existence in that region of several individuals, most formally Integrists of exceptional organizing ability. However, among them was a stocky, rather austere lawyer born in Huelva, who is now resident in Seville, Manuel Falconde. And I just want to emphasize again that Andalusia, traditionally in Spain, was the home of the majority of the Mozarabic speakers, the Moriscos, and thereby the target of the Inquisition throughout the 16th century. So it's logical from a certain point of view that this area would be the most hostile towards the notion of Catholic Spain. Yet at the same time, it's very interesting that, as we see with the nature of the uprising in the south, based around the city of Seville and the coastal cities such as Cadiz, that how much essentially can we owe the success of the various regional identities of Spain essentially to this reinfusion of Carlist energy and just expanding upon Manuel Falconde. Between 31 and 33, Falconde rose from virtual obscurity to the position of regional delegate for the whole of Andalusia. Aged 37 in 1931, he gathered around him a group of even younger provincial leaders, Jose Maria Avila in Cordoba, in the brothers Contreras in Granada and Jaén, and the Huelen family in Malaga. Assisted by an enthusiastic, second-rank leadership, these representatives of the wealthy Andalusian bourgeoisie deliberately set out to capture the Catholic youth and artisan class of the region, a measure of success that was made possible by the effective paralysis of the rest of the Andalusian extreme right before 1933. Whilst valuable financial support came from prominent wine and sherry producing families such as the Alvears of Cordoba and the Domex and Bobadilas and Gonzalezes of the Jerez district, Between the end of 1931 and early 34, local organizations were created in numerous Andalusian towns and villages, and a base established which held firm even though further expansion was curbed after 33 by the growth of the Catholic conservative Pradera and the Falconde. Andalusian Carlism, which under Falconde enjoyed a kind of de facto autonomy within the communion. I think we can understand for obvious reasons, given the fact that he was essentially the organizational force behind this new iteration of Carlism, new as an organizationally new in the south, differed in three important respects from that of the northern and eastern Spain. In the first place, the manner of its development in the area of no family or local Carlist tradition led to a far more intense preoccupation with organizational criteria. Secondly, the youthfulness of its leadership was mirrored throughout the regional movement. In many parts of Andalusian Carlism was exclusively the affair of the young, the older generation of conservative Catholics, either remaining emotionally attached to the cause of Alfonso XIII or attracted by the Theda. Thus, whereas much of the north and the eastern younger elements of the movement, the Carlist youth, the student section or AET, and the militia or the requites, were attached to the circles and local committees dominated by a whole presented younger and more radical image. So again, it's interesting, isn't it, that it just referenced to the whole notion that there is a like an ideological fidelity again to like Alfonso XIII. I think you can see this even today, say for example in England, with a lot of a feeling among the elderly essentially for that nostalgia effect of Elizabeth II, and indeed now the monarchy of Charles III. But it is, interestingly enough, it is the youth of Andalusia, the radical youth, who are representing this far more undiluted, purist interpretation of what a traditionalist monarchist movement is supposed to represent. And again, this is the legacy of that youth movement, which had begun, several decades before. It's now really bearing fruit in the 1930s.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the Blinkhorn's narration of the build up to the Crusade of 36 and Manuel Falconde's activities is very good. There's not really anything to compare it with in the English language, but the organizational genius of Manuel Falconde is critical here, and there remains some tensions, you might say, or differences of strategy between Manuel Falconde and the particularly the southern Carlists, as you say, who are incredibly energetic and active, and some of the sort of Navarrese nobles who had long led the Carlist movement in northern Spain, which is going to be important with regard to the future of Carlism and how it was excluded, let's say, or dominated in the nationalist peace settlement.
This was reflected in a third difference, a greater stress upon the working class, although in part a symptom of Southern Carlism's lack of an established pattern of class allegiance. This also represented a response on the part of the genuinely, if vaguely radical young Carlists of the region to the inescapable presence of a large-scale and prolonged unemployment with its attendant miseries, something of which many of the communion's northern members had little direct knowledge. Seville Carlists in particular harped on the iniquities of capitalism, and during 1932 a significant trickle of urban workers began to enter the city circle. Early in 1933, a worker section was formally instituted in Seville to provide the facilities of labour exchange and accident and unemployment assurance for Catholic workers, to train working class propagandists in order to promote further expansion and to nurture within its bosom a rudimentary guild system which was hoped would act as a germ of society's future organisation. The workers' section was an instant success, no doubt because until the creation of its Theda equivalent some months later, it was not only a body of its kind, it was the only body of its kind in the city. Attracted by the prospect of jobs, 1,000 civilian workers joined in the first month and 3,000 in the first 6, at least if the section's own claims are to be believed. Even though the true figures were much lower, the achievement was far from negligible, especially when viewed alongside the self-confessed failure of the Seville's Falconde workers' organization during the next 2 years. Although the success of the Seville workers' section, which was followed on a smaller scale elsewhere in the region, contributed to the distinctive flavour of Andalusian Carlism, its membership actually revealed the continuous limitations of a populist appeal to the working class. Not only were its members by definition Catholics, they were also overwhelmingly artisans and craftsmen, rather than true urban proletarians. The latter remained as alien as ever from the message of traditionalism, while their rural worker was concerned Andalusian Carlism, financed in part at least by the large landowners, was conspicuous by its silence. And again, the urban proletariat, those who didn't go over to Marxism, for obvious reasons, being the main target of Marxist propaganda, tended to go over to the Falange, and the Falange made very overt conscious associations with its movement as a proletarian movement, even adopting the blue shirt of the proletarian essentially as the uniform of the Falange. What gave importance to the variations between southern Carlism and that of the north and east was not the former's numerical strength, which in relation to the movement as a whole remained slight, but its mere existence, which testified to Carlism's powers of expansion and boosted its claims to be an organization of national scale. The result was a disproportionate amount of publicity in the communionist press and the eventual ability of the main beneficiary of the publicity, Falconde, to exercise a crucial influence on Carlist strategy. Now, this is where I think you're going to find Blinkhorn far more controversial in dealing with his ideological, again, assessment of Carlism vis-a-vis essentially interaction, or its attempts basically at historical restorationism or reenactment, or in his words, basically seeing this as a farce. And I just want to preface this. I'm not sure whether you've seen this or not, but a while ago I did a video on Franco, and I just want to briefly quote just a couple of sentences from that stream because it's indicative essentially of what Blinkhorn is going to discuss. All reactionary traditionalist movements of the 19th century, from de Maistre in France to Uvrov in Russia, were in a sense postmodern, as later distilled in some of the aspects of Nietzsche, espousing values that were eternal, organic, historically contingent, yet in opposition to the rationalizing and universalist impulses of the liberal French Revolution. The rift in historically contingent societies had already occurred, and the mission of the reactionary was to mend the rift, restoring tradition where the original link had been broken. As an organic process, such a truth to be found in traditionalism was meant as self-evident and unconscious phenomenon, and yet it required an intellectual movement to reinvigorate it. Again, for the purposes of this conversation, that is simply, I think, rehashing essentially a lot of what we have already gone over and basically concluded. But Blinkhorn goes on further to say, assuming that Carlism could hope to win power on such a basis, Falconde seems to have been no more aware than Bredesno, and he's a figure I want to talk at towards the end, or the majority of Carlists, of the inner contradiction in traditionalist theory as applied to a 20th century situation. That is, an ideal system was based upon consensus, devolution of authority, you've mentioned the aspects of subsidiarity in Carlist thought, and an absence of coercion, whilst the unavoidable means of achieving it would necessitate dictation, the concentration of power, and repression. During the Second Republic, few Carlists recognized, much less wrestled, with what was far more than an abstract point. In 1935, after 3 years of expounding traditionalist theory in Acción Española, the outstanding Carlist intellectual Victor Pradera published the El Estado Nuevo, the New State, a coherent, if somewhat aesthetic examination of the Carlist state, substantially identical with that had been outlined by his mentor, Vasquez de Mela. Pradera concluded that the new state in question was none other than the Spanish state of the Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella, and that should come as a surprise really to no one here, considering how much we've been trying to explain essentially what that system was. On the crucial question of how the past could be created, or how this state could be established without recourse to means which would reduce it to a farce, he was silent. And again, that in a sense, again, he's almost belittling the whole notion of the conception of the new state. But I mean, you and I talked about this privately before we went live, but do you have any sort of brief summary of the new state you would almost like to provide in contrast to that view?
You mean the Franquist state?
No, Pradera's book.
Ah, right. So yeah, I read a little bit about Pradera and how he approaches this tension in that as historic memory and lived reality of the organic traditional Catholic order recedes, it becomes more and more imperative to explain the principles of that order, but also elaborate on how they could actually be realized. And that is a real difficulty. Certainly, that's true. It's interesting how you described there, Blinkhorn described the establishment of the Carlist workers section, which I would say is a good traditionalist response to the new sociological realities. Carlism had not really penetrated urban proletarian Spain so far, and had obviously its strongholds were in rural smallholding regions. So yeah, that of course is a difficulty, but I'm sure you're familiar with the very famous and beautiful quotation from Joseph de Maistre, where he describes what the return of the king will be like after the revolution, in his considerations on the revolutions in France, written in 1794. And he begins by talking about the restoration of King Charles II and how after the austere tyranny of Cromwell and the major generals, the Puritan regime just melted away, and people flocked to their king because traditional monarchy and Catholicism is working with nature, not against nature. So it's all of these false ideologies, communism, fascism, liberalism, that need the apparatus, the coercive apparatus of the modern nation state, because it's like brushing, a horse against the grain of its fur. You have to put a lot of effort into keep brushing it that way. Whereas the restoration of traditional order is the restoration of the natural order, which corresponds to man's nature as it is. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be significant issues in how to deal with the working class and so on. But I would contend that had Carlism actually been able to solely seize power and establish a Carlist regime, and had, for example, abolished usury and confiscated the ill-gotten assets of liberal oligarchs, I think a lot of working class people would be quite on side with that Carlist regime. It's an open question. It's a counterfactual. We don't know, but of course the issue to contend with is that there is a background reality here of secularization. It's uneven, depends different parts of Spain. I've heard different estimations of what church attendance in Spain was like at this time, but I still do contend that if a political and legal order was erected, which at least safeguarded the liberty of the church, that secularization could be reversed. And that has happened in history at various times. In fact, it happened to a degree after the end of the Spanish Civil War.
It's very interesting, just to, before I forget, because the whole basis of de Maistre, but again, the realist in me thinks, how could the restoration have been so facilitated? And it was facilitated primarily because of the influence of one Civil War general who basically switched sides and supported the restoration, which was General Monk. And in this scenario, Franco, who essentially came out of the Republic, he was supported in the original rising by many other Republicans, such as Cabaneras, could have represented that General Monk figure for the Carlists. The problem is he didn't. It would be essentially if General Monk had toyed with the idea of bringing Charles II back, but all he did essentially was establish his own form of a military dictatorship. So, the theory is sound, but I think the issue is essentially that Spain didn't find its General Monk in Franco. But I want to come back again.
Well, there was General Sanjurjo, and that's why it's such a close what if, because if there hadn't been the accident where he died, it might well have looked very different.
Yes, and for reference, he was the nominal head of the what would have been the junta to lead the rising, but he died in a plane crash days into the original rising. But just to offer again a quick summary, because you mentioned again about the attractiveness to the workers of various elements of the Carlist program, just to expand on elements within Pradera. I've already mentioned again, and Blinkhorn mentions the fact that he was a disciple of Mela, but again, it's Estado Novo, even though it would later be corrupted by Franco, by his appropriation of that term, Estado Novo was essentially maximalist in that it envisaged the creation of the new old state. It's a bit of a it's a bit of a novelty to rephrase it essentially as not the eternal state, but as the new state. It's representing a complete reconception of Spain per the Republic, but not per the whole reality of Spain as he would have considered it. And again, it's very opportune that this is all written in 1935, just before the Rising. I mean, first of all, it's an explicit refutation of individualism in terms of appealing to the workers. All societal bonds and civilizational bonds are conditional on the acceptance of human dependence on God. And man is dependent on God. Man is also dependent on other men. So all forms of political organization, from the family to the town to the guild to the cortes, which is where fueros and anti-absolutism within this whole system sort of figures. A cortes has to necessarily be a body of the corporations of Spain, these bodies and these classes, not the individual voters, not a series of deracinated individuals with universal suffrage. It is a society of the societies, a empire of the Spains, and it is a dependency of dependencies, an organism as a living, evolving organism, not something dependent on abstraction like the notion of universal equality. And Spain is this reality, as is construed by Carlist thought. It is not something which has to be imagined. And again, Blinkhorn, on the one hand, is a very effective historian, but also he uses the word utopia very often in his writings. And I find that bizarre because, of course, as you know, utopia comes out of Catholic writing. It comes out of St. Thomas More. And utopia is, of course, it's a joke. It's Latin for no place. It's not meant to reference a particular ideal society so much as basically it's been appropriated by leftists to construct something that cannot be constructed. They cannot construct no place because they are trying to erect the earthly city, as you know, in place of the heavenly city, effectively. Hence the emphasis on utopia. So it's rather ironic that Blinkhorn tends to focus on that, but nevertheless, this almost stands in contradistinction to that. So Spain is reality. All its constituent parts are a consequence of historical relations. And to sever such links, so for example, a large number of Catholics went over and became particularly Basque and Catalan nationalists, as you know, Republicans. And the criticism from Carlism is basically that, okay, you may feel grievance against the central government in Madrid, but the history of Catalonia and the history of Navarre and the Basque provinces is of relation to Spain as a concept. It has been throughout mostly its entire history. You could point to various spurious examples, like the French-Spanish marches or whatever during the time of Charlemagne and around that time, and briefly during the 17th century. But nevertheless, it is anti-historical, effectively, to advocate for Catalan and Basque nationalism. And when it comes to the monarchy is better than republics because, again, in imitation of Christ, it is the closest to perfection but never achieving it. It basically imitates this order but cannot override the reality of Spain through absolutism and definitely but not through liberalism. The monarchy essentially has to be envisaged as a balance between the councils, and the councils, again, explicit association with the Habsburg monarchy in Spain, with Philip II as constituted, the various councils of the Crown of Aragon, and all the various realms effectively were governed by a series of, again, you could say sub-cabinets within the overall construct of monarchy in Spain. It wasn't a unitary state. It was a series of councils, the Cortes, the parliamentary body, and the fact essentially that the monarch, of course, has the inherent executive authority. That's the basis of monarchy. But that authority must be limited to the medieval concept that the king's first role essentially is the peace of the realm, the preservation of peace, the administration of justice, and of course the purpose of defense against invasion, whilst education and spiritual matters should be a matter for the church and not explicitly for the monarchy. And thereby, when we talk about Catholic social teaching, that should inform the basis of economic participation based on the Catholic conception around the common good with balance to respect for private property, basically adopting elements of distributism. So as you can tell, it's actually a rather cohesive, well thought out program within the bounds essentially of what traditionist thinking and theory could essentially achieve. So I find it again interesting that one can basically reject it and say that it would be a farce. As again, I think the assumption is, I mean, you've already mentioned the Maester example with the Restoration in England, and you've mentioned the tantalizing example of a counterfactual with General Sanjurjo. But I think a lot of the assumption again here is that in order to achieve this, you would almost need a Carlist Lenin, which would be a absolute contradiction in terms, or at least that seems to be his line of reasoning here, in order to achieve a centralizing vision and then reimpose a vision of the past on Spain. And unfortunately, Pradera would be executed almost immediately following the commencement of the hostilities.
I'm afraid I'll have to take my leave fairly soon. AM. It's been a very interesting conversation. I think, yeah, there's, as you say, the Carlists had a very profound and detailed doctrinal program and manifesto for Spain. So these issues were really grappled with, and I think it's difficult for modern minds to even really conceive of what a traditionalist regime would be like in actually willingly releasing those levers of state, relinquishing those levers of state, not having recourse to them. Of course, with the Francoist regime, they very much did use those authoritarian measures, but that's not the Carlist way. And the very fact that we don't have historical precedents of a traditional movement taking power and, as I say, relinquishing those regimes and undoing all of the revolutionary harms that have been done to the Spanish body politic over the last few hundred years. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. That just means it's very much against human fallen nature, but that's the action of grace. The disposition of grace is to receive what is gratuitously given by God rather than to grasp. The modern mind has a really difficult time with just allowing for God's providential care as our loving Father to provide. And just to add as another tangent, although we've spoken a lot about the Spanish monarchy, it's worth pointing out.
Sorry, you cut out there, or I might have cut out.
That's my microphone. The proposed Carlist political settlement is an Aristotelian mixed regime, like that beautiful equilibrium that Joseph de Maistre and others so admired, the English medieval constitution. In fact, the oldest parliamentary body in history was the Cortes of Leon, which was convened by King Alfonso IX in 1188. So Carlism admits of a democratic element in the constitution, just not the liberal democratic principle which overwhelms all other political elements.
Now, you need to go soon, but I think I'm going to cut certain segments of the stream short, because I really want your commentary on the last bit, unfortunately. And these streams usually run for just under 3 hours, but nevertheless, I think just again to summarize the authoritarian tendencies among the Carlist right, which is what this article goes into. The Alfonsists, obviously being centralists, have fewer qualms with it. The Falange, obviously, the whole basis of fascism is totalitarianism, everything for the state, nothing outside the state, essentially. So they had no qualms with that. And as you mentioned, of course, Franco doesn't either. So Carlism, you would say again, is at an ideological advantage, but a political disadvantage. So just quickly, in terms of the Carlist commitment to the rising itself, to the civil war, For Carlism, it had to represent in Blinkhorn's view, a compromise with authoritarianism in the interest of a minimum program acceptable to the realists in Navarre, in return for a guaranteed defense of law and order and the destruction of liberalism and the repression of the left, the imposition of Catholic unity, and by no means at least Carlist control of Navarre itself, they implicitly surrendered any hopes of non-coercive cooperatism previously central to traditionalism. The spirit of Carlism, they were able to convince themselves, lived on in the nationalist cause, albeit within a potentially dictatorial framework essentially alien to Carlism. The maximalists, led by Falconde, were disinclined to give up the struggle for several months and comforted themselves with the delusion of a Carlist military partnership destined to install the traditionalist monarchy as soon as the war ended. Delusion in hindsight, it should be emphasized. Every effort was made to stress the independence of individuality of Carlism with the patriotic crusade, especially after the almost simultaneous death of Alfonso Carlos and the elevation of Franco to the headship of the state in autumn of 1936. Falconde was given great preeminence in several Carlist periodicals, and a deliberate campaign was undertaken to attract workers and employees in the Obla Nacional Cooperativa, national cooperative effort, an initiative designed to serve the infrastructure of a future traditionalist corporate state. Although partially successful, the ONC proved not the strength but the weakness of the Carlist cooperative system, since it functioned only against a background of force, provided in one case once removed by the army, when Falconde, backed by a new pretender, Don Javier, attempted to underline the independence of the Carlist militia by creating a royalist Carlist military academy, he went too far. The plan was instantly squashed by Franco, and Falconde, with the acquiescence of Ledesma and the Navarrese, was exiled. So determined had Ledesma and his faction become to preserve their minimum program that during the early months of 1937 they sought to unite the Falange with the execution of Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera in the Republican zone, lacked an acknowledged leader, and was ideologically weakened, the recent absorption of thousands of sadists and Alfonsists. The talks founded were enough to persuade Franco of the need to effect a fusion of the two leading political organizations of nationalist Spain. When the forced unification came about in 1937, it provoked protests only from the exiled Falconde and a handful of disoriented followers. Ledesma and his circle had found their ally at last. The unification of April 1937 was the logical conclusion to Carlism's flirtation with authoritarianism over the previous 6 years, aspects of Carlism and pragmatic flirtation, which was itself probably the only way out of a communion's ideological dilemma. Subsequent developments proved both Ledesma and Falconde correct according to their own very different criteria. Traditional monarchy was brought no nearer, the Carlist role in state and the single party created in 1937 would diminish, but they still held on to a redoubt, at least in Navarre, and of course even that is gone. So the last thing I want to, and I hurried that segment in order to get your thoughts on this. The legacy of Carlism effectively divided into two camps, but I've given an extra sort of segment to the Octavismo, which is a novelty in and of itself, but mainly we're talking about the fusionists or the Franco-Carlists under the Ledesma, and the quote-unquote maximalists or the Falcondistas or Jaravistas under Falconde. So I just want to get your sentiments just before you leave. Obviously, you're going to probably prefer Falconde over Ledesma, Lorenzo, but how essentially do you summarize or view this acquiescence of aspects of Carlism to the Francoist regime, or the Falconde offer essentially of complete non-association with the Franco-Carlists, and even the banishment of the Franco-Carlists from the traditionalist communion?
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, the Carlists were gravely hindered from the very outset of the crusade by the death of General Sanjurjo, and then later in 1937 the death of General Mola, who was himself not as sympathetic to Carlism as General Sanjurjo had been, who had actually been somewhat cultivated by Falconde while he was in exile in Portugal. He came from a Carlist family. So the misfortune of the combination of those two accidents was devastating to Carlism's post-war fortunes. And then, as you outlined there, the Carlist structure is slowly absorbed and co-opted by the Francoist regime, which establishes itself. Franco himself was an improviser and an opportunist, and I think, like, he's obviously a subject of a whole nother broadcast. But he notably made a radio broadcast in October 1936 from Seville, in which he said that the new regime, the new state, would be totalitarian and totally secular, which caused such outrage in the ranks of the Nationales that he had to retract it. And in fact, the Archbishop of Seville was threatening to publicly condemn Franco.
Sorry, you're cutting out again.
Oh, sorry. Is that better now?
The last thing I heard was outrage among the Nationales.
Yes, and that the Archbishop of Seville threatened to publicly condemn Franco over this positioning. So he had to retract, and he had to assimilate some Catholicity into his program for the future state. And this is something that, as you say, Rodezno, the Navarrese Carlists, were in favor of accepting. But the king, who at this point was Don Javier of the House of Bourbon Parma, was not in favor of, and neither was the chief delegate Manuel Falconde. Of course, those elements which collaborated with Francoism over time eventually, of course, ceased to be Carlist, because in collaborating with an authoritarian regime, they were no longer able to uphold publicly their fidelity to the legitimate dynasty, to Catholic unity in its entirety, and to subsidiarity. The Francoist state was highly centralized, for example, although there are exceptions made for loyal provinces like Navarre. So eventually it resulted in a dissolution of those elements that collaborated with Francoism. Now, the relationship between Carlism and Francoism is very interesting, and maybe one for a future discussion. Because, of course, Carlism opposed Francoism, but was careful in the manner that it did so, because they did not want to destabilize the regime in any way that might benefit the revolutionaries, the left, the Reds. So it was a difficult balancing act, but the structures, the centralizing authoritarian structures of Francoism were quite successful in suppressing Carlist circles, Carlist activity for many decades. But Franco's regime did not even declare itself Catholic until 1945, 9 years after his assumption of the Generalissimo as a caudillo. And that was really to secure Vatican support for his regime after the defeat of the Axis, in the wake of suddenly a very different international environment for his regime. So he, as I say, he was opportunist, and he reformed and transformed his regime a number of times, repositioned it. But nevertheless, I think we should acknowledge that the Carlists did secure important, tangible policies and commitments from Franco's regime that collaborationists like Rodezno could point to. A traditionalist leader was appointed, for example, the Minister of Education, and so the church was once again returned to her primary role in education. That's not a small thing. That's a very major policy area. And Masonry was suppressed and banned under Franco. There was a strong support given by the church, and a prohibition on the proliferation of false religions as well in Spain. So the Carlists did gain something from the regime. It was clearly better than the Second Republic, but for Carlists who always look not for the lesser evil, but for the true good, it was not enough.
So, do you need to go right now?
I can stay for 5 minutes.
Okay, good. So no, it's very interesting. Again, you bring up these points because Rodezno, I mean, you could either interpret him to be a traitor or a tragic figure in many ways that was duped by Franco. I haven't necessarily made up my mind because the whole basis essentially was that I mean, you can almost say kind of like the original Hitlerian coalition under Franz von Papen, which was conceived of as a Prussian national rightist monarchist coalition and not a Nazi coalition. I think when Rodezno was negotiating the declaration of the unification with Franco, he was guaranteed 4 out of 10 members of the first incarnation of what would later be the FET, the fused party essentially of the national movement within Spain. And considering the numbers of Carlists, again, you can look at that and say, I've won a massive concession. But thereafter, essentially, yes, Primo de Rivera had died, and that was another, you can say, galvanizing reason as to why Rodezno would believe, well, they've lost their charismatic leader. That will be a great cause again for believing that Carlism, intellectually at least, will have the dominant sway over the Francoist regime. But nevertheless, when the unification happens, the Carlists interpret it that they are being fused into the Falange and not vice versa. And as you mentioned, it's the authoritarian, totalitarian elements which are to predominate under Franco. Essentially, he has assumed the role of Primo de Rivera for himself, whilst all of the subversive elements of Falangism have basically been put to rest. Whereas Carlism has a far more established political program, as we all know, and an established regional power base. So they have the concessions, which is this regional identity in Navarre. But again, in terms of this tragedy, you mentioned that in 1945, it is declared a Catholic state, a national Catholic state. But the monarchy, quote unquote, is restored in 1948. And again, for Franco, this is a bit of political genius because he declares the restoration of the monarchy, but for the next 27 years, there is no restoration of the monarchy until Juan Carlos in 1975. So it allows essentially for Rodezno, who again had been brought over to the Franco regime almost with a bribe, with a ministerial post. He was made Minister of Justice under Franco for a brief amount of time before returning to Navarre. He became part of the faction of Carlists who became, quote unquote, legitimists. And you can go back here, and after the death of Alfonso Carlos, we have this bizarre situation where the legitimist claimant to some is actually the hated Alfonso XIII, who to the Carlists would be Alfonso XII. And when Alfonso XII dies in 1941, his claim is given over to Don Juan. And so Rodezno becomes the leader of the Don Juan faction and begins this lobby to see the restoration of the monarchy under Don Juan. And the ironic thing is he concedes all of these elements of the Carlist program to the Francoist. He allows essentially Carlism to be subsumed into Franco's own interpretation of Falangism, and yet he espouses the cause of a monarch who is despised by most of the Carlists, and he, despite all of that, never becomes king. It's instead Juan Carlos. So you can look at all that and say that Rodezno is a rather tragic character in the fact that he was, I think, masterfully played by someone like Franco, essentially, to fall into all of these traps one after another. But as you mentioned, Falconde doesn't respond in the same way at all. He was offered the same bribe effectively by Franco, becoming a minister within the government, and refuses to comply. And he is the one advising Don Javier to expel these Franco-Carlists from the movement, and even attempts essentially to rescue the elements of the Carlists from the fused National Party, the FET, and he fails in this. He issues a manifesto to Franco demanding the return of traditional monarchy, which Don Javier, not necessarily being king, at least offered a role in a regency council alongside Franco until a king could be declared. And again, the assumption among many Carlists is to look, say, for example, to Sixtus Henry as either a king or indeed as a regent. So the Carlists were prepared to concede the idea that if Don Javier is a regent, our program is at least being advanced in some respects, but nevertheless, this is denied. And Franco places Falconde under house arrest and under surveillance. And so Conde continues this policy of non-compliance in opposition to Rodezno. He's even accused of attempting to undermine the regime during the course of World War II, where Franco is playing this balancing act between the Allies and the Axis powers. And finally, it comes to a head after the war in 1951, where he declares Don Javier King of Spain in Barcelona, and thereafter he is banished from Spain. And it's interesting because he remains loyal to the cause of the Bourbon Parmas. Again, it's not something we really reference, but the mainline Carlists die off with Alfonso Carl. Thereafter, I mentioned the fact that we had this bizarre situation with Alfonso XII. I'll talk perhaps about Carl Pius when you go, but with the House of Bourbon Parma, these were designated heirs by Alfonso Carlos. The House of Bourbon Parma were not a junior branch of the royal family, but a different cadet branch ruling over the Italian Principality of Parma, in the same way that there was a Bourbon branch that was ruling over, or at least pretending to rule over the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, etc. And Don Javier was considered again to be ideologically the closest aligned to Alfonso Carlos, among various other reasons for why he would have been the designated successor over, obviously, who would have been the alternative as Alfonso XII. So he was selected, and that begins the course of the House of Bourbon Parma. But nevertheless, we get to Carlos Hugo, and I think just before you go, would you like to basically explain the issues that Carlos Hugo and the Bourbon Parma claim really represent for Carlism going forward throughout the last years of the Franco regime?
Well, I'm afraid I really don't have the time to do justice to this really important issue and this period. So I'll just summarize really that as you point out, the House of Bourbon Parma, Don Javier, are defined and acknowledged as the Carlist legitimate claimants. By the way, I think I saw in the chat earlier someone say Alfonso XII wasn't legitimate. I think that's a really important point here, that actually from the Carlist view, all of the liberal claimants are all illegitimate, since there's quite strong evidence to suggest that Alfonso XII was not the son of Francisco de Assis, the homosexual husband of Isabella, and the fact that Alfonso XII was the son of a guards officer.
Yes, indeed. And I've seen that as well.
Yeah, and Francisco de Assis refused to attend the child's baptism. So there's plenty of evidence to suggest that. Anyway, but yes, Carlos Hugo was in favor of collaboration with the Franquist regime when there was still an open question as to who would be designated as the successor head of state after the death of Franco, and it was still considered possible that Carlos Hugo might be designated as opposed to Juan, so-called Count of Barcelona. So yes, he began that, but then he went in a highly heterodox and un-Catholic, un-Carlist direction at the same sort of time as Vatican II, and the combination of those two disasters really dissolved much of the remaining cohesion of Carlism as a mass Catholic movement. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to end on that note for a future broadcast.
Yes, I'll release you from your service. Just to say thank you so much, Theo, for coming. You've been an absolutely fantastic guest. It's been wonderful to have you. Anything you would like to say, or any projects you have coming up to make the audience aware of?
Just thank you very much for the opportunity, AM. It's been a really interesting discussion and highly detailed. I am currently presenting a series on traditionalist economics, where I hope to try and lay out some of the principles that come to us, partly from Carlist thought, other Catholic traditionalists, and how these might be realized in modern circumstances. So that might be of interest to your audience. But thank you very much, and look forward to speaking again.
Good night.
Viva Cristo Rey. Good night.
So I'll just finish off this stream. Unfortunately, we no longer have Theo. So the implications of Carlos Hugo, I mean, to be specific, he became a Titoist. So not only did he become a leftist, he became actually, you can almost say, an iteration of communism, which is what Titoism represents when he comes to the fore of Carlist politics in the early 1960s, again at the time of Vatican II, as Theo has alluded to. Now, again, this causes a major crisis within Carlism again, as we see with the examples of Juan III and Jamie with Mella. The ideological predisposition of the Carlist claimant is essential. And given the fact that the Carlist claim is already contested, and as we already see that Rodezno has gone over to support the Count of Barcelona, Don Juan, this again proves a further crisis. Again, also to the intellectual supporters of Carlism. Now it's becoming virtually inert as a political force. So say, for example, Tejero Spinola, the political theorist and historian, goes over and supports a group called Renonce of Navarrese and Catalonian local politics by one of those Carlist families, which has already been alluded to under Bobadilla. But Falconde remains loyal. Indeed, Don Javier declares him to be a grandee of Spain. And given the fact that he comes from very obscure origins, the fact that he essentially arises to become the grandee of Spain is a privilege which the Carlists have bestowed uniquely upon him, considering that he wasn't a member of the Bourbon dynasty. And it is because of the implications of Carl Hugos and the fact that the Carlist king was essentially wedded to a progressivist formula, a progressivist ideology, that Tejeda Spinola goes over and begins to support the claim of Sixtus Henry, the uncle of Carlos Hugo, in opposition. And Sixtus Henry is still contested as the Carlist legitimist claimant vis-a-vis the son of Carlos Hugo, who would be Carlos Javier, as we see here. But then, moving on from that particular end, I mean, it is sort of electorally and politically fatal. The Carlists were able to carve out a niche in Navarre, which was accepted by Franco as unique, considering the centralizing measures and the Spanish constitution that was adopted to reincorporate the Basque separatists and the Catalan separatists following the Spanish Civil War. But when we have the birth again of quote-unquote parliamentary Carlism, with the return of, again, democracy, parliamentary democracy under Juan Carlos, the Carlists emerge again as a left-wing party, and they are defeated and basically become I wouldn't say again irrelevance in Spain, but nothing compared to the potent political force that we saw during the 1930s, or even when they were a lesser force, but still a prominent force in Spanish political life throughout the 1920s. And then we'll get to the final sort of bizarre element in Carlism, which is just worth noting, because again, I think this is more testament to Franco's brilliance than anything else, and this is the collectivismo. This comes out of the movement, the Crusaditas, the Crusaders, and again, a line of thinking, of interpretation, was that as Alfonso Carlos was, again, his 80s during the time of his pretense, Nejera, that you see in the image in the center, was concerned that there needs to be a new claimant who can represent that ideological purity for the movement. And this was in 1931, 1932, before Don Javier of Bourbon Parma had been designated heir by Alfonso Carlos. And so this movement assumes a life of its own under other sort of intellectual forces and historians like Burgos Torres. Indeed, many of the intellectual contributors to Carlism were again, they wouldn't consider themselves revisionist historians, but revisionist historians in terms of the mainstay of Spanish historiography. And this collectivismo movement evolves into supporting their own candidate, which you can see in this image here surrounded by the red, which is Karl Pius von Habsburg. And this was born out of one of Meller's interpretations. Meller, the master of Carlist political discourse throughout the early 20th century. He interpreted that as per the traditional semi-Salic succession law of Spain, it was possible that a true Carlist claimant or a true monarch of Spain could come through the female line of the Carlist claimants, now that the original dynasty was effectively extinct. And if you consider that Alfonso XII and his successors were illegitimate, then essentially one would need to go further back and find a legitimate claimant through the female line, was the logic of the collectivismo. And they settled on Donna Blanca, who was a daughter of Charles VII, you can see here on the top right. And she was married to a Habsburg archduke. And one of her sons, she had various sons, but her youngest son, Karl Pius, in 1943, took on the cause to be a Carlist claimant to the throne of Spain based on this link. You can say it's a double link. Being a Habsburg, of course, he has that link to the glory days of the Siglo de Oro, the golden age of Spain during the Habsburg monarchy, from Philip the Handsome up until Charles the Bewitched, or really you can say especially sort of evoking memories of Philip II, and therefore the Karl Pius candidacy was rather unique. It was also taking place amidst the Second World War, where I was not sure essentially whether the Axis or the Allied powers would win. And so again, there was an international component, essentially where the heir would come from and which particular heir in Spain had political backing from various groups. So take Don Juan again, the son of Alfonso XIII or Alfonso XII. Don Juan actually petitioned the Nazis to lead an invasion against Franco to restore the monarchy. So all of these Carlist claimants and non-Carlist claimants were politicking effectively to find a way to assume the restoration, even though the monarchy was restored in all but in name only in 1948. But having essentially presented Karl Pius as a candidate, collectivismo closely aligns itself with the Francoist program, in opposition with the maximalists under Falconde and the House of Bourbon Parma. And in spite of their fidelity to Francoism, they're effectively sidelined. And you can almost say that when Franco chooses to be succeeded by Juan Carlos, who had grown up in Spain and had been a product of the Francoist system, in his mind, that Juan Carlos would be a placable, pliable successor to Franco, whereas these other candidates were simply proven accessible. Indeed, you can say, trying to defend Franco, that they would ensure the continued unity of Spain and the survival of the national Catholic project. But as we saw with the swift restoration of democracy, that was not to be the case either. So as for the legacy of Carlism, why I'm so attracted to Carlism, well, it should be evident. As we saw during the 1930s, Carlism was able to prove itself a party of mass action. But unlike the other aspects of the Spanish right, which tended towards authoritarianism, Carlist scruples basically would not countenance a maximalist option in terms of seizing power by military means. Again, it's interesting to look at the earlier Carlist wars and the attempt to restore, say, for example, Carlos V or Carlos VII, where these were wars akin to the Jacobite wars that we see in England, that the later Carlist program or settlement, the means to attain power and the whole nature of the state, remained resolutely attached to this idea of the ideal historic state of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. So all of these things, again, are very interesting. I would regard Carlism as the purest incarnation of quote-unquote legitimism. It's by far the most coherent, and I think it would be my principal motivation to learn Spanish, as so many of the essays and the correspondences between these thinkers are, as of yet, to be translated into English. Indeed, even if they are translated into English, as with Pradera's El Estado Nuevo, they are almost impossible to find regardless, because there hasn't been this intellectual proliferation of Carlism into the Anglosphere. And even when we see second-hand accounts and secondary sources like Blinkhorn, they tend to be very rare, even with a historian like Stanley Payne and the main historians of the Spanish Second Republic. Carlism tends to be lost compared to the other quote-unquote rightist movements that supported the Nacionales during the Spanish Civil War. So I'll end it there. Covered a lot on this stream, and very grateful for Theo's contributions. So I'll go to the super chats, and thank you everyone for listening thus far. Waylon Bocephus for $2, Habsburg Spain or Bourbon Spain. Habsburg Spain or Bourbon Spain, in the sense that I have a personal preference to the dynasty, or which one was superior. Well, relatively, Habsburg Spain was superior, and also Habsburg Spain was far closer to the Carlist vision of Spain than Bourbon Spain was. Like we've said, Bourbon Spain was essentially an attempt to impose French-style absolutist institutions via Philip V onto Spain, whereas the system of the Cortes and especially the Crown of Aragon, which was dissolved by Philip V, these things again were contrary to the whole notion of the fueros of the Carlists. So from that perspective, it would be Habsburg Spain. Alex Roberts for $10. Thank you very much. Glad I found Carl Benjamin. I was very unsatisfied with modern politics, and he gave me a clear direction. That wasn't mid-century German or Duma. Astounding work, AM. Well, thank you very much, Alex Roberts. That is in reference to a semi-joke I made. I'm not sure how many people took it seriously before seeing the title of the stream. That Carlism could have been inspired by Carl Benjamin, and the whole notion that Carlist thought could become Carl Benjaminist. We'll see. But thank you for your super chat. The Eccentric Tripper for $5. Great stream as always, AM. Thank you. Having no skin in the game, which pretender is the most legitimate to you? Or is the current king bloodline most legitimate? Okay, well, this is, again, it depends on whether you think Alfonso XII was legitimate. And if you think Alfonso XII is legitimate, then Louis Alphonse is the King of Spain and the King of France. Logically, you know, he's the by primogeniture, he's the oldest son of King Jamie, of Prince Jamie, who didn't marry morganatically. So Louis Alphonse is the heir. As to the others, I know Carlos Javier has begun styling himself as the rightful King of Spain, but I haven't done a thorough evaluation of his political thought, if there is an extensive amount of it. I will suggest, however, that simply based again on the whole notion that ideology and legitimism have to come together in symphony, essentially, with Carlism, that Sixtus Henry is the closest, even though, you know, he's 85 and, you know, getting on in years. So like we see with the system with Alfonso Carlos, there'll have to be a new heir soon. Right. Are there any last I mean, is the current bloodline most legitimate? I mean, King Felipe of Spain is only there because of you know, a younger son, the grandson of a younger son designated by Franco was made king. Effectively, like I said, Louis Alphonse has the superior claim. The contest against that effectively is that Prince Jaime, couldn't succeed because he was mute. So he was disbarred by his disability. Someone is saying, which dynasty do you prefer? As in personally, probably the Habsburgs. I mean, the Bourbons in Spain produced one good king, who was Carlos III. He began as the Duke of Parma. He conquered Naples from the Habsburgs in the 1730s. He re-effects the Pacte de Famille with France. He begins the quote-unquote Bourbon reforms and the quote-unquote Spanish Enlightenment, even though that has about 50 quotation marks around it, given all of the criteria we've been outlining for the notion of Spanish intellectual thought and Spanish nationalism. Other than that, I don't believe there are any good Bourbon kings of Spain. And Philip V definitely wasn't a good king. He was clinically depressed throughout most of his reign. He even abdicated to his infant son, who then immediately died, and he had to restore his claim to the throne. So he was not a good king. He was not a liked king, and he was dominated by his far more intelligent and effective wife for the latter part of his reign, his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, who eventually won by getting her son Carlos III on the throne. All right, I'm going to leave it there. So thank you everyone for listening, and good night.